I'm gonna pause the recording. All right. Thank you. So again, I would just like to start by thanking our sponsors, the Alaska Wildlife Alliance membership, who through your donations have made this possible. We also receive support from the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center and USGS, as well as EA Engineering, Science and Technology, Inc., and the National Parks Conservation Association. You can find more information about all of our sponsors on the workshop website, which I'll put in the link here in a moment, and on the workshop agenda. So I encourage you to learn more about their work and reach out to their contacts if they are some folks that you would like to connect with. I also want to give a big thanks to our wonderful steering committee who's made all of this planning possible. You'll be hearing from them throughout the workshop, but would like to recognize Meda, DeWitt, Jeremy Littell, John Morton, Bill Templin, Joel Reynolds, and Sue Rodman. So thank you to them for all of their work and time to organize presenters and get this event together. We also have an incredible list of a very robust roster of speakers who have volunteered their time to speak at this workshop. So we'd like to give an advance thank you to our speakers and to all of you who joined this morning in the early hours to learn more about these strategies for climate adaptation. So thank you. Wanted to give a quick introduction into the Alaska Wildlife Alliance, who we are. We were founded in 1978 by Alaskans to protect Alaska's wildlife for its intrinsic value, as well as for the benefit of present and future generations for Alaska. We advocate for healthy ecosystems, scientifically and ethically managed to protect our wildlife in an increasingly dynamic world, particularly in the context of climate change. And so we have three primary goals to ensure scientifically sound and humane wildlife management. We are in the process of developing a novel climate change adaptation program for wildlife in Alaska, of which this workshop is a part of that program, and to inform Alaska's citizenry to speak up for wildlife. So you can learn more about Alaska Wildlife Alliance at our website, akwildlife.org, which I'll throw in the link as well. And again, thank you to all the members who make this possible. We are a member-supported organization. And with that, I would like to introduce Meda DeWitt. Meda is a Tlingit traditional healer and Healthy Native Communities Indigenous Facilitations Fellow. She works for the Wilderness Society as a specialist, focusing on the Imago Initiative. She is here with us today as a steering committee member to provide the opening blessing and land acknowledgements.
Nicole, le ka klenach Meda DeWitt yuchat doasak Tlingit klenach zetzinak yuchat doasak nanyaina chatsiti kachadi yadi chatsiti shtakin kwan ayachat. First, we're going to talk a little bit about land acknowledgements, and that introduction was in Tlingit. I'm not going to translate the whole amount because we're wanting to make sure that we stay on time. But Alaska Indigenous people, we have 20%. So Alaska is a very large state, and some of you are calling from in-state and some of you are calling from out of state. And so I always like to ground us in the understanding of how large Alaska is. So we're about 20% of the United States land mass, and we have 229 tribes of the 567 BA registered tribes. We have over 11 different cultural groups with 22 different dialectical variants in our state. So it's very diverse up here. Alaska also makes the United States an Arctic nation. It's the only state that's included in the Arctic. And with our size and our location, we're also changing 2 times faster than the rest of the United States. It impacts our natural spaces, our physical health, and also our behavioral health. So when we're talking about Indigenous people, we have to recognize that they've been here since time immemorial and have stories about transition through climate change. And the main theme through these stories is sovereignty and the ability to view the situation in an entirety make decisions as a community, and move forward together, being well informed, which this is what this conference is based on, is understanding the totality of the situation and moving together as a community. Through this process, we need to recognize that land acknowledgements are a standard best practice, increasingly common amongst academia, governmental, and professional spaces. Excuse me, I'm nervous this morning. I'm usually not nervous in conferences. I'm excited about today and all of these amazing ideas. But land acknowledgements recognize the indigenous people of the land, and it's not political or subjective. I think all of our different disciplines can recognize that indigenous people have lived in these spaces and are still present, living and well and thriving. And it's essential that we recognize this process as a matter of respect. So in the past experience with advancement of colonization across the United States, as an aftermath, part of that is the erasure of the indigenous people. And so collectively as a community, we can work to eradicate racism and erasure of indigenous people by providing land acknowledgements. So I'd like to invite all of our presenters, it's not required, but I'd like to invite all of our presenters through the next 3 days to acknowledge the traditional peoples of the land which you are on. There are websites that you can use to find that. I'll put them in the chat for you. So that way, if you want to look it up, you can. So today I am calling in from Dena'ina Athlana, the traditional lands of the Dena'ina people. I'd like to give gratitude for the tribe and the people who still reside here today for allowing us to live, work, and play on their traditional lands. They also share knowledge widely and are generous with their culture. Ganashchish. So for our opening blessing, please follow along in your tradition or religion. Tleka Klenach, as I said, my name is Meda DeWitt. So Hashagenya, Hashagun, Dikyankau, Ganashchish, Ganashchish, Ganashchish. We give gratitude for the life and creation that we have been blessed with. We give gratitude for being able to come together in community. And we give gratitude for allowing us to have the best science and culture available to anybody on Earth to allow us to move forward through these changing times. Ganashchish, we ask for blessings and we ask for strength and courage to make the best choices and move forward with grace. Ganashchish, 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 Hashakakau. So I'd like people to also, if you want to type in where you're calling in from, your English translation of where you're calling in from and the traditional lands, and we can see where everybody's at. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you, Meda, and we appreciate your time in the morning to give us that lovely blessing. Before we get started with the presentations, I wanted to recap on what the goal of this workshop is. And as the steering committee has discussed, we brought everyone together here today because we'd like to push the boundaries of thinking about how we can respond to climate change in Alaska and to get out of our comfort zone of what we think about when we think of adaptation in these rapidly changing times. And to give some context around how we're framing the workshop, we're using the Resist, Accept, Direct framework to organize presentations by themes. So this workshop is not about RAD, as it's called, Resist, Accept, Direct framework itself, but we'll focus on highlighting new ideas and the ways that people are accepting, resisting, or directing change in Alaska. And so the workshop, as you know, is 3 days. And each morning we will be talking about a new theme within that framework. So today, all the presentations will be focusing on ways in which folks are accepting. Tomorrow, Thursday, will be focused on resisting, and Friday will be touching on directing. There will be question and answer sessions with presenters, as well as facilitated discussions at the end of each day. So we encourage viewers to put their questions into the chat. And thank you, Jeremy, for putting the link to the agenda in the chat. You can follow along on the agenda there. I also wanted to note that on Friday, from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m., we're going to have an open forum, basically to brainstorm next steps. And so if you are available at that time, we would love to have you. As you can see, when you joined, the presentations will be recorded and available on our website after the workshop. And I'm also joined by Alaska Wildlife Alliance staff. We have Sarah, Kelsey, and Mandy. Mandy and Kelsey will be taking notes, and that will be supporting a report that Amanda will be writing up after the workshop to summarize what the workshop was and some of the discussion that happened here today and over the next few days. And with that, I would love to introduce Amanda Sesser. She is the facilitator that we have chosen for this workshop, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to her. So thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Can you hear me okay? Great. Welcome, everyone. As Nicole mentioned, I'm going to be the facilitator for today. I'm going to start off with some logistics, but first I'll say that I'm on the ancestral lands of the Chitimacha here in New Orleans, Louisiana. As you may have noticed, you as a participant do not have a mute button. So all attendees are in listen only mode for this. It was something that we decided to do this in a webinar format, given just the sheer number of participants. It's just going to minimize the amount of people who leave their mute button off and are typing away or having a background conversation. So having said that, as Nicole mentioned, we're going to ask that you place all your questions in the chat window. When we are going to be providing all of these presentations in their PDF format that you can download, as well as recordings of the presentations, of course, for those speakers who give us permission on the AWA website. So if you've missed something or you'd like to hear it again, you will have access to that in the future. The way that the agenda is organized is that we have 2 presentation blocks per morning, and each block is followed by a 15-minute question and answer session. So rather than having the question and answers immediately following the talk, we're going to do it at the end of the block for 3 or 4 presentations, 1 question and answer session. And those are for questions that are really needing to clarify, to ask for clarity or something that might be confusing. You will put your questions in the chat window for that. So I do recommend writing your questions down as you go and saving them for that question and answer block, just so we don't miss your question. And if you're putting it in real time, we'll do our best to capture that question and bring it up at the end during the question and answer session. But if a lot of people are putting in things into the chat at the same time, you're at risk of losing your question. It could just get lost in the shuffle. So if you can, write down your question, save it for the end, and we will try to get to everybody. Having said that, with this many participants, it's probably going to be hard to get to everybody's questions within a 10 or 15-minute time period. We will do our best, but there will be a panel session at the end of the day, at the end of the morning, that you can ask your questions then, or you can follow up with an email to Nicole at AWA, or you can contact the speaker directly. For the speakers and the panelists, I am going to give you a time warning at 5 minutes and at 1 minute. And today's agenda, all 3 days agenda, are really packed full of amazing, wonderful speakers, a lot of great information. And but we're going to have to do the transitions pretty quickly to make sure that we don't run over and that somebody at the end doesn't get squished and not get enough time for their presentation. So for the panelists and presenters, I thank you in advance for the smooth transitions among speakers and for maintaining the time limit. I will give you a 5-minute warning and a 1-minute warning, or a time, not a warning, a time check, we should say, and much less menacing sounding. But at that 1 minute point, I will ask you to state your main points, even if you still have 3 slides left. Just state your main points. What's the take home? Because we are going to need to transition to the next speaker. So with that, I'm going to jump right ahead and introduce our first speaker. I really appreciate everyone joining this morning. I'm going to pass it over to John Morton, the Vice President of the Alaska Wildlife Alliance. John, take it away.
Okay, do you see my screen in my full screen?
You're
Okay.
good.
All right, that's great. So I do work for the Alaska, or I'm on the board of the Alaska Wildlife Alliance, but for I just retired from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service a couple of years ago. And for 18 of those years, I was the supervisory biologist at Kenai National Wildlife Refuge down here on the Kenai Peninsula. And this is where I've done a lot of my thinking about resist, accept, direct, which is a great way of thinking about climate adaptation. What you're looking at here, this has been sort of my muse. This is a deforestation event that's occurring in the southwestern corner of the Kenai Peninsula. And this is, I'm flying above Caribou Hills looking westward, and in the distance I'm looking across Cook Inlet to the Alaska Range. And what you're seeing is the beginning of a 40,000 acre polygon of Calamagrostis grasslands that's developing in the southern part of the peninsula there. And it's this extreme ecological transformation where RAD, I think, is very helpful, because it really gets you to think about how would you direct this system? How would you resist this system? And I think I'll leave it as that, but Dawn Magnus, who's on the third day, will be talking about exactly about this case study here, and I think you'll find it very interesting. So RAD is not my thought process. It's really the coevolution of two groups, of which I was part of both of these groups. And the upper photo shows the group that met in Seattle. I think we were back in 2017. So it gives you an idea how long we've been working at this. And I'm kind of giving you the abbreviated version of what resist, accept, direct is all about. This was a group that was orchestrated by the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Center in Reston, Virginia. And it was American Fisheries Society and the Wildlife Society joint group of individuals that got together and put a lot of thinking into how to deal with ecological transformation. The lower group is mostly federal agencies, so it's a slightly different group. There we were orchestrated by the National Park Service's Climate Change Response Program in Fort Collins, Colorado. And we met about the same time, and these two groups have kind of gone along with a little bit of cross-pollination. And you can see the products on the right that have come out basically at the beginning of the pandemic, and we've continued to put out a number of products since then. Gives you a sense of what we're doing. So what is RAD? Okay, RAD is simply a decision framework. That's all it is. And this is a great quote from Alice in Wonderland. But the beauty of RAD is it forces a decision. And I'll show you how that's going to work here. The other thing that's very nice about RAD, as opposed to, say, a lot of other planning processes like scenarios planning or open standards and other formal planning processes, is it specifically addresses directional change. So in this graph here, we're looking at, this is the standard, long-term climate variability. The upper two lines, the green and the red, are basically showing what has historically been the truth, where we have a lot of variation, but the mean change over time, the slope of the line, is zero. And of course, what's happening now, as we all know, is we're in a very different place. And that's what the blue line, and to a certain extent, the black line down below, the sine wave function, basically says that we are still having variation. That variation is extreme. But the significant piece here is its directional change, because the slope is now a positive slope, and we're getting change over time, and it varies, of course, where you are and what part of the globe. The other thing about directional change, if it happens fast enough, or if it happens long enough, we will eventually get ecological transformation, kind of similar to what we're looking at the deforestation event on the southwest corner of the Kenai Peninsula. And this whole business of ecological transformation, Steve Jackson will be specifically addressing that issue on the morning of the third day when we start talking about directed, how to recognize it, and well, just a bunch of other very cool things about that. So what RAD does is it squarely assigns the adaptation response to a managerial, if we're thinking land agencies, or a societal decision. Okay, and so it's forcing that decision. And in my mind, and not all the RAD documents agree with this, but in my mind, the goal of all of this effort is a self-sustaining, self-organizing system. You really don't want to be doing intervention forever because that's not sustainable. And so the way these resist, accept, direct are verbs that are all in response to directional change. We can resist that directional change, we can accept that directional change, or we can direct the directional change. And in resist, that's all about the historical baseline. We're resisting with the goal of trying to hold some historical baseline. And it's very arbitrary what you choose for that historical baseline. It could be the Pleistocene, it could be, pre-colonial times, it could be now. Whatever you want it to be, but you draw a line in the sand and you say, we're going to resist. On the other end of the business is directing, and we could direct towards some specific, future state. And it's a little bit more unstructured, because even though we define what that future state might be, it's not clear that we'll actually get there. And so in that instance, we're going to invoke a lot of adaptive management. And I think tomorrow, the last speaker is Abby Lynch, who will talk a lot about adaptive management in her conversation. And then, of course, we can accept change. And in this instance, when we accept change, we're talking about directional change. We're not accepting status quo, we're accepting change. And there's lots of reasons why we might accept it. And very briefly, it could be we accept it because it's infeasible to manage. And by that, I mean, it could be something like permafrost thaw, right? There's very little we can do about that on a large scale, although we'll have a conversation about that later. It might be a change that we know is occurring, but it's insufficiently impactful to warrant a response. The change might even be acceptable and even desirable by some stakeholders. And actually, a really good example is the fact that, in Alaska, we're starting to think about climate refugees, people coming up from the lower 48, because they like the fact it's getting too hot down in the lower 48, and Alaska is actually warming to a more benign place for a lot of humans. We can accept it because we don't know that it's occurring. And that is, I think that's the truth for a lot of parts of Alaska. There's all kinds of changes occurring that we know nothing about. And then we can also accept it because there's a lack of will or impetus despite sufficient knowledge or resources. And maybe it's politically not doable. So here's my brief, short, quick notes on some of the attributes of RAD that I think are so important. I mentioned earlier, the goal is a self-sustaining, self-organizing system. We really don't want continual intervention. We'd like to kind of abort that. But when I talk about intervention could be decadal. I mean, we could be talking about many, many years of trying to move a system or resist a system. The beauty of RAD, in my opinion, is that the three decision bins are all encompassing, in the sense of all encompassing the decision space. There is nothing outside that decision space. So you have to pick one or the other of the three. And the beauty of that is that it promotes what I call bet hedging. So most of the changes that are occurring in Alaska right now, we are accepting, we're implicitly accepting. RAD says, make it explicit. We are explicitly accepting, explicitly making that choice of accepting. And the bottom line is, as soon as you make that choice of A, you're suddenly aware that there's R out there, and you're suddenly aware that there's D out there. And so if you're monitoring some change, this bet hedging forces you to ask, well, how long am I going to monitor for? At what point am I going to make a decision to do something other than accept? Am I going to resist it? Am I going to direct it? And that is, in my opinion, one of the beauties of the whole RAD thing. As far as this last point, I think is very important. This idea that RAD really promotes some choices that we can make to prevent decision paralysis, because I know many people on this Zoom call here, many folks have been part of climate adaptation planning, vulnerability assessment, and very often the conclusion is we don't know enough, or we're uncertain enough about the model outputs that, you know, we really can't do anything right now. So more often than not, the default response is simply to monitor. But, you know, the reality is beyond inventory and monitoring, there are things we can do to reduce that uncertainty. And we talked very specifically in the RAD pieces about the idea of using experiments to test ecological trajectories rather than just simply saying our model outputs, our model forecasts are uncertain, right? And that's kind of the significance of experiments. And the other piece that we're pushing as well is the idea of doing pilot studies to test potential adaptation. And so here in this slide here, the upper right-hand corner, these are Youth Conservation Corps crew at Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, and they're building an exclosure to do tree planting of exotic trees. And this is a way of testing what trees could actually grow on the Kenai Peninsula. The lower left is an idea of an experiment. One of my big laments with leaving the Kenai Refuge is that we have this instance where we're having deforestation on the Kenai, and it's the result of spruce bark beetle and grassland fire. And the whole argument is that grassland fire will continue, or the grassland itself will continue to expand as we get more and more fires, whether they're human caused or lightning caused really doesn't make any difference. And then there's a discussion about, well, what's that ecological trajectory? My big lament here is that I could have tested that by simply using prescribed burns to speed up the rate of grassland fires rather than simply wait for this to occur in real time. And so that's a way you could do an experiment to actually test, you know, how valid are your forecasts for ecological trajectories. And then this last idea on the bottom is this whole issue of beaver dam. And I threw that up there because down in the Homer area where we've got a project going on down there where we just put in for a NOAA grant to look at whether beaver can be used to restore drying wetlands on the Kenai Peninsula. And so that's, again, a pilot study of potential adaptation. I did want to mention that tomorrow morning, the first two talks right out of the bat are Ted Schuer. He'll be talking about an experiment, whereas he's accelerating the rate of permafrost thaw up at Denali National Park. And then there's Andy Ewan is talking about a pilot studies that he did to launch what we call thin layer deposition to restore wetlands down in San Diego Refuge in Southern California. So this is the best case study I'm aware of to illustrate RAD. And what we have here are 3 national wildlife refuges. They're all on the eastern shore of, the East Coast. And what's really nice about this is we have 3 different units. They all have the same purpose, and the purpose is to basically to manage habitat for wintering waterfowl. And they're all being exposed in this instance to the same big ecological driver, which is sea level rise. And sea level rise on the East Coast is very, very high. It's actually something like 3 or 4 times higher than the rest of the globe for a number of reasons. And to give you a sense of scale here, the distance from Chaffee National Wildlife Refuge down to Chincoteague, which is in Virginia there, that's about 350 miles as the crow flies. And a sense of scale too, Chaffee Refuge is about 550 acres, so a very small refuge. Chincoteague Refuge, which is a barrier island off the coast of Virginia, is about 14,000 acres. And Blackwater Refuge, which is located in Chesapeake Bay on the eastern shore of Maryland, that's about 28,000 acres. So it gives you a sense of the size of these places. And this is some data from forecast data for NOAA just for a 1 foot sea level rise. And if everybody's tracking, you know we're going to have much greater than a 1 foot sea level rise. but this is just to the end of the 2100. And so all that blue is going to be inundated by ocean. And Blackwater in particular, it's such a flat topography. It's very similar to the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta in the sense of how flat it is relative to the water around it. You can see how much blue shows up with just a 1 foot rise in sea level rise. So Chincoteague provides a wonderful example of accepting. When you look at this, again, this is Assateague Island. And Assateague Island is a barrier island off the coast of Virginia and Maryland. And here we're at the southern end looking northward up towards the island goes up for about 35 miles all the way to Ocean City, Maryland. So on the right is the Atlantic Ocean, and on the left is Bayside with in the background there, that dark line is mainland Virginia. So in the immediate foreground, what you see, the sandy beach is managed by Assateague Island National Seashore. So by the national park, primarily as an area where people go to, walk the beach and go swimming and go surfing and all that kind of stuff. So it's very high recreational use. On the left, particularly in the background there, you see a lot of salt marsh, and that's the Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge. And again, that's managed as a waterfowl refuge. And they have something like a dozen impoundments that are, diked impoundments that are brackish or freshwater that have actually been built since the 30s and 40s to, improve habitat for wintering waterfowl. But the really important point here about this is for 60 years, starting back in the 1960s, both the refuge and the Park Service have actually been rebuilding the artificial dune system here. And they've been using bulldozers, they've been using fences to trap sand, and they've been using
5 minutes, John.
very conventional beach restoration, with beach transplanting. Anyway, so this is what this looks like after a storm event. We have the Atlantic Ocean on the left, and you've got a flooded parking lot on the right. And what happened was, after 60 years of building this, Park Service and the refuge agreed to abandon this. They decided this wasn't worth it, and basically it just got too expensive. And basically they're going to allow the island to migrate. And in that process of accepting change, you have a Park Service facility had to be moved. 2 refuge waterfowl impoundments were abandoned. This is after decades of maintaining these impoundments. They've decided they're just going to let them erode. So it's kind of a rough place to be. That's an accepting. Oops. Let's see if I can move this. Resisting change. Here's a great example from Chaffee National Wildlife Refuge, the one up in Rhode Island. And here they decided to restore wetlands that were disappearing because of sea level rise. And what they developed here on the right, you see an excavator. And what the approach that they used was to do what's called thin layer deposition, where you actually dump silt on top of the degrading salt marsh, and you actually build it up over time, usually like 6 inches at a time. And in this instance, it wasn't so easy because the silt that was coming out of the narrow river there was so fine that they actually had to develop a new amphibious excavator, which you see on the right. And then when they dumped it on the salt marsh, it was sloughing off. So they had to end up using 3,000 bags of clams and oyster bits basically to build a containing wall. So that's a great example of resisting. Here at Blackwater, it was a very different situation. We knew that wetlands I used to be the supervisory biologist here back in the early 2000s, and we knew at that time that we had lost a lot of tidal wetlands to open water. What we didn't know at the time was that the marsh was actually migrating upslope into adjacent agricultural lands. And so to a certain extent, down in Blackwater, they've done what's called a portfolio approach, where they accept, resist, and direct all at once. Some wetlands are being lost just to open water, and they're just turning into, ocean. In other areas, they're doing that same thin layer deposition where they're trying to resist it. And then in other areas, they're actually extending the head of tidal creeks with this low pressure excavator that you see in the lower right there. And there, this is a pilot study where they're actually trying to encourage the marsh to move into very low agricultural lands to create wetlands. So very quickly in Alaska, we do have a good example here, and I almost hesitated to bring it up because this is something that obviously affects a lot of people. Here in Kimberlee, it shows a great example of a town, that up there on the Chukchi Sea that is decided to resist sea level rise by hard armoring with riprap. The one over on the upper right, that's Nutak, where, Nutak is losing land at the rate of 70 to 90 feet per year. And there they've decided to abandon. And so it's an accept mode, right? And what they've done is they moved
1 minute.
They moved 9
Wrap it
miles
up.
upstream to Murtarvik, where they've started to rebuild the community. But what really makes it directed is even as they're rebuilding the community in Murtarvik, they're also building an evacuation road to an evacuation center, which is going to be their safe haven during extreme events, despite the fact that they moved to a more upland site. So very quickly, there's a lot of other papers that have been published, by the 2 RAD groups, and we have a special issue that just came out in January. It had 5 articles in there, and they touch on a lot of different pieces to RAD, including the science that's needed to make these kinds of decisions. There's one that's specifically on adaptive management. There's one that deals a lot with some of the social constraints and the thought processes that we need to move this forward. And that's because climate adaptation, it's not rocket science. It's actually much harder than rocket science because it involves people. And every time we involve people, we have to make choices, and we need good participation. And obviously, for any one sector we benefit, we're obviously impacting others who may not be so happy with these choices. So I'm going to leave it there.
Thanks, John. That was a fantastic presentation. We really appreciate that. I'm going to introduce the next speaker. Next up, we have Jeremy Littell. He's a USGS research ecologist focusing on climate impacts. So Jeremy, if you can get your screen shared, you can take it away.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, John, for that great lead in. Now I've got to get to where I need to be. Are we good?
You're good.
All right. So, John, well, first of all, thanks to all of you for sharing your time with us this morning. I'm glad to see so many familiar and so many unfamiliar faces in our audience. I'm hoping we can have a great dialogue. I'm tasked with following John, which is always a hard act to follow, but what I was asked to talk about is RAD what? If you think about the consequences of the decisions that John outlined and the impacts they have on people and ecosystems and other things that we manage and care about, the more knowledge that we have, the better understanding we have of the processes and the ways they're changing in the environment, in the Earth system, the better able we are to choose between R, A, and D, or add 2 or try all 3, depending on what the consequence or what the circumstances are. So I'm going to talk about some of the trajectories in Alaska that we observe and some of their projected futures. I have no hope of covering everything that's important in the time I've got, so I've picked some for the examples that they illustrate, and I'll try to walk you through those. This story about the drivers of climate impacts often starts something like this. You'll see a map, in this case, one of the Arctic. So we're looking down at the North Pole. Alaska is in the middle left. This is a map of the Arctic that shows how much warmer the last 10 years, so 2012 to 2021, have been compared to 1970 to 99, which is the period a lot of us were growing up in and are familiar with. In most of Alaska, that change is about 1.5 to 3 degrees centigrade, or roughly double that for Fahrenheit, so 3 to 6 degrees warmer for the last 10 years than the 3 decades towards the end of the 20th century. We all have heard by now the various assertions that the Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the Earth, and averaged over the Arctic, that's true. But as you can see from this graphic, those changes aren't distributed equally, at least for the decade that I've mapped here. And one of the main points here is that we know that that 2 to 3 times faster number is valid, but the reality is very different across the Arctic depending on where you're talking about, how fast it's warming, and what impacts that has. The impacts vary tremendously across this this part of the planet, and even just across parts of Alaska. So part of the theme that I want to get to today is some of those changes and how they vary across Alaska. Tomorrow's risks really depend in part on what happens today and how that unfolds in the future. By now, you've probably also seen something like this, which is a graphic that describes the warming trajectories that occur under different emissions scenarios going into the 21st century. And we think about them often as a range of risks, from lower changes with lower greenhouse gas emissions to higher changes with more greenhouse gas emissions. And we tend to attribute risk variously to those: higher risk versus less risk. Preparing for that high end is something we call risk averse. It means trying to prepare for the larger impacts, and then if they don't happen, you consider yourself lucky and you were prepared. The other is risk tolerant. You're willing to hedge your bets a bit. It means accepting that increased risk and the cost if the impacts do occur that comes with warming. So we often collapse these futures and the drivers that are getting us toward them into relatively easy to think about differences: high risk, low risk, more warming, low warming. The rate of change in climate and ecosystems that we see in Alaska is sufficient, though, that the emerging systems don't resemble those we have experience with. And yet we're in this unenviable position where our models and management are based on the experience that we have with those systems. And so they're only as good as our questions. We have to ask ourselves not just what the changes and drivers are, what we're radding, rad what, but also how do those changes vary across landscapes and systems as diverse as Alaska or the planet, if we want to. But then also, where are these models and our management ideas from the past likely to fail us? What surprises are lurking out there? What extremes do we encounter that really change the game in ways that we hadn't anticipated? And models are able to help us with this, but they're not perfect. And so when we think about future climate change and its impacts, it's tempting to follow tempting to fall into the trap of considering those scenarios as very either or, higher, lower. But I want to make the case that we shouldn't do that, and what we should do instead. So a tale of two risks then, with maybe a couple of subplots depending on how fast that warming occurs. So what you're looking at here are two maps of Alaska. One under the moderate warming scenario I was talking about earlier, RCP 4.5, if you like acronyms, and then higher warming under RCP 8.5 on the right for the end of the 21st century. And you can see that the rate of warming expected in Alaska is higher in the North Slope and the northwestern part of the state, say, than it is in the Southern Aleutians or in Southeast Alaska. And that's true regardless of which future or which set of risks you choose to think about or want to plan for. How many different gradients there are here just depends on how you divide the map up, right? But the degree to which it's warmer on the North Slope versus Southeast varies in these futures as well. Again, the idea here is we often then start to think about, okay, well, it could be either of these two scenarios. Maybe it's something in between. These are just annual average temperatures. Again, a simple set of futures. These are the things, though, that get communicated. This is a graphic from the last National Climate Assessment. We're working on the next one now, but we often, again, fall into that trap of a simple characterization. Is that enough? No. Look around you. If you spend any time in Alaska or the Arctic, you know that there are many, many more such stories than two sets of risks and the subplots that go with them. Now and the plausible future are way more complicated than that. And it really depends on what aspect of these systems most affects you, how it interacts with other things that are other impacts that are ongoing in other systems that are related. And in reality, we've got an Earth system that's highly interconnected, highly responsive to the changes that are occurring, and the impacts to food security, to managed federally managed ecosystems to transportation, everything that matters is being affected. So in reality, we RAD impacts, not just 7 degrees centigrade of change, or maybe less than that in Southeast, or maybe more in the Northwest Arctic. Instead, we're concerned with these interacting stressors and the ways that they impact things that we manage or care about. So I'm going to give you a tour of some of these real quick. This is a map of the change in active layer depth that's projected in the future under a single climate model for a single decade in a higher warming future. Reds are increases in the active layer depth. That's an indicator of permafrost stability. And so reds are where the permafrost would thaw more if it was there to begin with in the 20th century. Blues are places where you might actually expect an expansion of the active layer depth toward the surface, depending on the changes that occur in surface snow, for example, or vegetation. In reality, we know permafrost affects infrastructure. It affects the hydrology of these systems profoundly. And so understanding the rates of change in permafrost and how they vary across the landscape and in the different futures that we might experience is absolutely critical to our choices of resisting, accepting, directing, or some of all three. And permafrost is a very complicated response to temperature, but in reality, it's the one that matters for many of these choices, not just the temperature. Here's another one. This is a change in snowfall percent over the cold season, October to March for Alaska under a higher end warming scenario. This is an average of 5 climate models rather than a single one. It's a similar picture. You see that southern and southwestern and southeastern Alaska have very large decreases in the snowfall and snowpack that you would expect during that season. And then actually in the Brooks Range, you have some places where it's still cold enough, even under that scenario, to get an increase in snow during that period. One of the things this doesn't show you, for example, is that the late fall and current spring changes in snowpack erode very quickly, even though the changes in the core of the snow season may not be that profound. So it doesn't talk about the change in snow season, which is a big deal also. But the
Hey, Jeremy.
change, yes.
Hey, sorry to jump in. I forgot that you had 15 minutes, whereas John had 20. So yep. I'm going to go ahead and give you your wrap it up warning.
1 minute?
Yeah, you can take a couple if you need it. Okay.
Same thing for changes in runoff. Here's a change in springtime runoff, increasing water availability due to snowmelt in places where we didn't used to have runoff in May. Very large changes, potential impacts for salmon. Here's a change in water deficit, which is the difference between water availability and water demand from the atmosphere. We expect increased precipitation, but in the summertime, we actually could have less water availability under most of these scenarios because the change in temperature is so large. It's more than just fire. These are changes in future fire that we would expect from a couple different climate models. The graphic on the right shows changes in white spruce area. You got 2 climate models that project roughly a similar future to now, but others that project a very rapid transition over a few decades to one that's dominated by deciduous forest rather than spruce, a fundamental transformation over much of interior Alaska under those climate model futures. Not just 7 degrees of warming or something, but a very profound and rapid change in ecosystem cover. It's more than just spruce to deciduous, though. These changes have huge consequences for hydrology, for habitat, for migratory bird habitat, wetland stability, things like what John was talking about earlier, and even fire management. The changes in fire hazard also follow. Eventually, we get fuel feedbacks, which is a luxury potentially in the future. But the choices for resist, accept, direct depend greatly on those complicated mechanisms. I'm going to skip one on sea ice because I don't have time, but it's more than just the ice-free season. Instead, we're thinking about the interactions of storms and flooding and the effects on communities. It's not just the physical system and its response. The future, no matter how we slice it, is going to be a bumpy ride. The variability in these systems, because we're at the edge of the Arctic and the North Pacific, is huge. We fall into this trap all the time of thinking of this future moving smoothly into a warmer world and maybe a much more warmer world. But instead, it's really full of these sorts of surprises. Today's extremes very rapidly become tomorrow's ordinary in most of these futures. So when do those impacts really come home to roost? Okay, I'm going to close with this idea. For a decade, 2, or maybe more, we've focused on the exposure and sensitivity of the system. How much warmer, what direct impacts? We haven't thought as much about adaptive capacity, and that's where RAD really comes home. we're ready in Alaska and the Arctic to move past the 2 to 3 times everybody else's temperature change. We need to be trying on all the plausible futures in all their complexity. I've shown you that there's a lot of different storylines that unfold in Alaska under relatively simple warming trends that we think about. What actions are workable depends on which of those Alaska impacts geographies that we work within. So I'll leave you there.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was an excellent talk and a wonderful photo there to leave on. Appreciate it. Next up is Tom Paragi and Kimberlee Beckmen. Tom is going to be the one presenting. He's a wildlife biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game in Fairbanks. There we go. Tom, we see your slide. Just get it into presenter mode. Got it. Take it away.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Kimberlee Beckmen, wildlife veterinarian, and we're located in Fairbanks in the traditional territory of the Lower Tanana Dene people. So John Morton asked us to address 2 carnivores and 2 ungulates that are about to be coming into Alaska, or already begun. To talk about some pathogens, we're going to focus on those that affect ungulates, and I'm going to briefly mention implications of biome shift for our existing big game. So the fish is a terrestrial mustelid. They're sexually dimorphic, which means males are about twice the size of females. They're endemic to North America. Their historic range goes out to the coast of British Columbia and Southeast Alaska. Currently, they're about 5 a year, caught by trappers in the Southeast Yukon. If you look at this range map here, in the red is approximately where fishers currently exist in British Columbia. But you've got some of the major rivers that come from BC down into Southeast Alaska. They're likely some of the movement corridors for species like fishers and mountain lions. Right now, their fishers are down, particularly in the Juneau area. They've been around since about the 1990s. There was a trapping season opened a few years ago, and trappers catch 2 to 6 a year, all in the Juneau area. So to give you an idea about their size, adult male fishers the size of a small dog. A characteristic is a really long tail, almost the length of the body. For comparison, its smaller cousin, the marten's, about the size of a house cat with a shorter tail. Its bigger cousin is the wolverine, a much larger terrestrial mustelid. And finally, the diminutive member is the least weasel, the ermine. So in terms of an ecological niche for fishers in the mustelid community in Southeast, fishers prey on small to medium-sized mammals and birds. They're one of the few species that can kill and eat porcupines without detriment from the quills. They eat berries. The weasels, and to a lesser degree marten, they hunt a lot of small prey beneath the snow or subnivean, but fishers are getting a little bit big to do much of that. One ecological separation we've seen elsewhere in North America is marten tend to have an energetic advantage in deeper or less dense snow compared to fishers that sink in more. So overall, I think fishers do co-occur with these other mustelids and other habitat across North America. And if fishers were to become established in Southeast, I don't know that you'd see any catastrophic reorganization of the mustelid community or the wildlife community in general. Mountain lions are also sexually dimorphic, with the males being larger. Their distribution is primarily up the western third of North America into British Columbia. Some of their highest densities are on Vancouver Island. It's probably reflecting their prey density there, the deer. There have been images seen as far northwest as Whitehorse. We've only got 2 confirmed in Alaska, one about 30 years ago near Wrangell and one about 20 years ago by South Kuprianof Island. We occasionally do get credible sightings near Skagway and Juneau. In terms of getting definitive evidence on there is no hunting season for them, so we have to rely on things like roadkill, images. Maybe if somebody sees a predation kill to suspect, you can get some DNA samples, and confirmed tracks are also useful, but they are misinterpreted with lynx tracks. So their primary prey is deer. So if they did become established in Southeast Alaska, they would become another predator of Sitka black-tailed deer along with wolves and bears. So it would probably affect some of the dynamics of managing that hunted species. And there's a lot of folks out with the pandemic they're out doing stuff in the woods. That's great. And we're getting lots of reports about mountain lion tracks, but our tracking specialists put together a video here to show people that they're really quite distinctly different from lynx. And so far, all we've confirmed are lynx tracks, no mountain lion tracks. So mule deer and white-tailed deer, they're kind kind of shown from our regulations booklet, the size difference among those three species relative to the size of people. The Sitka black-tailed deer exists in southeast Alaska. It's believed to have come in following the retreat of the last glaciation coming up from the south along the west coast of North America. The white-tailed deer and the mule deer occur further east on the continent. The primary morphological difference has to do with the size and shape and coloration of the tails on them. And then the male antler configuration is a little bit different. So if you look at the range of the mule deer, it occurs kind of across the western half of North America. Sitka black-tailed deer are primarily in northern BC and up through the southern panhandle. They were introduced into the Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, and Kodiak about a century ago. Government of Yukon has the distribution of mule deer right now, kind of in this southwestern half of the territory, almost up to the Alaska border. White-tailed deer distribution is much more broad across the North American continent through Central America and into northern South America, but doesn't get near too far to the northwest. So we're mostly going to talk about mule deer now, although I'm going to come back to white-tailed because if they ever got here, it would be a bit more dramatic, I think, than mule deer. So in Alaska, mule deer have been showing up for several decades, pretty much one at a time. They've been coming into the eastern interior since at least the 1970s, probably just mature animals dispersing. They have shown up south of the Alaska range from the Yukon in the last couple decades. Most important now, we're starting to see evidence of reproduction of mule deer. There was images of a doe with fawn near Eagle. More surprisingly, as far west as Fairbanks, a fawn was photographed and there was a mature buck killed by a vehicle. To my knowledge, it's the only carcass we've got in the state that was necrops eaten. And in the last couple of years, been showing up around Skagway from BC, and again, evidence of reproduction. So right now, the Yukon does have a hunting season by permit for both mule and white-tailed deer. They require samples for disease surveillance. In 2020, Alaska opened up the conditions for no close season or bag limit on either species, and we're trying to get biological samples, understand what they may be bringing with them. And for those of you that have a hunting license, if you are in these game management units kind of on our eastern border with Canada, these are areas where it is legal for you to take one at any time, no bag limit, but we are requesting biological samples from them. So Dr. Beckman put together several slides that have a lot of detail. I'll just try to hit some of the high points, and then you can look at the archive of this that the groups can put together here. It's got a lot of the details and citations. So if you look at epidemiology, it's an interrelationship between a pathogen, that may be a fungus, a bacteria, a virus, or a parasite, and the host species. And the interaction is mediated by the environment. So a lot of times you have a coexistence between a pathogen and a host, and it's not a problem. It doesn't become a disease until it becomes the point where the pathogen begins to overwhelm the host. And that's where it starts to affect the fitness of the host, their ability to reproduce, get their genes in the next generation. And so the environment's really the moderator on this. So when you have an environment that's not particularly beneficial to the pathogen, it's not causing health problems in the host, then the coexistence is much larger component than the disease. But if the environment changes to the advantage of the pathogen over the host, then you see expression of the disease. It goes from endemic to being epidemic. So this is an example that veterinarians put together in terms of looking at an example of a parasitic nematode. So think of stomach worms. And this shows the interrelationship between one environmental factor, temperature, and some biological rate. So in this case, what you have is a lower threshold whereby once you start exceeding that, the survival shown in the blue increases substantially, but then it starts dropping off. Whereas the developmental stage of a particular pathogen may change on a different functional curve that peaks much higher temperature before dropping off at some upper developmental threshold. But what you see in here is kind of an optimization where both the survival and development have been increased. And here's where a situation where something can dramatically increase its rate of development or its abundance in the environment. Same things happens with things like spruce bark beetles or spruce budworm. They go from being endemic to epidemic or having an eruption. Here's an example of a protostrongylid or lung parasite for northern ungulates. This one, the species Otocoilei, before 1995 was primarily along the west coast in the range of the Columbia black-tailed deer. But if you come since 1995, it has moved dramatically north up through the Gulf Coast of Alaska and into south central Alaska and as far east as Alberta. So that's a fairly dramatic change in the last 30 years or so. And there's another example of a muskox lungworm that's dramatically spreading northwest from the Northwest Territories into Nunavut. The species we're most concerned about right now is the moose winter tick. It's a relatively small tick that you can see it's fairly small size for male and female adults. When females become engorged with blood, when they're getting ready to lay eggs, they become much larger. Here's an example of a moose that's had a fairly heavy infestation where the amount of animals that were drawing blood was becoming such an irritant. They're grooming themselves, they're rubbing against vegetation to scrape off the hair and that excess skin and the parasites. And so this is what they call a ghost moose. It's a fairly characteristic hair pattern on the neck and the shoulders. This map put together by veterinarians shows that by mid-2000s, the range of the winter tick was kind of up through south central Yukon and southern Northwest Territories. I'm going to come back to this triangular area in the Yukon because there's specifically infestations there with elk and mule deer. But this was an example, even though this was the range is the best they understood it, there were moose that were found several hundred kilometers to the north that did have infestations with winter tick. So the moose themselves are spreading it. So from the lower latitudes, we see the evidence of how climate warmings can affect this balance between the pathogen and the prey. So with a warmer climate, you have less spring snow. This is important because the engorged females tick drop off the moose in April and go onto the ground. If you got snow there, it really hinders their development. They got a lot of mortality. But when you don't have spring snow, those females can survive and lay eggs, and there's direct prediction ability to see what the amount of tick infestation is going to be in calves that fall, so they can reproduce in greater numbers. In places like New Hampshire, winter ticks have accounted for 41% of deaths in monitored moose, including nearly all calf mortality. Many of the moose populations in the northern tier of the US have been declining, directly related to winter ticks. It's perhaps most striking in Minnesota, where about 30% of collared adult mortalities were due to parasites, primarily winter ticks. But here's where the white-tailed deer comes in. They are specifically vectors for a couple of things that are very strongly detrimental on moose and caribou. One of them is the brainworm. That was in almost half the dead adult moose, and also liver flukes were fairly common. So if white-tailed deer comes further north into Yukon and Alaska, it's, I think, much more of a worse situation than mule deer. So specifically what's happened in the Yukon is that by the early 1990s in the southeastern Yukon, down around Watson Lake, they started seeing winter ticks on horses and a moose. By the mid 1990s, winter ticks were on elk and mule deer in south central. So in this part of the Yukon right here, you can see this is a different hair loss pattern on the elk. The Yukon government tried to do some intervention on this to reduce the spread. So they intensively managed these couple herds that were in the south central Yukon by reducing their density to try to hope to reduce the spread. But nonetheless, there's still, after that, we're finding 100% of the elk in that area were infected with winter tick. The more disconcerting thing is that winter ticks have been found on mule deer and other parts of Yukon where there are no elk. So it's not just their co-occurrence with elk. And when they did a sample of that 7-8 years ago, they found that more than half of the ones that they got were infected with winter tick. So in Alaska, we were fortunate that some colleagues of ours many years ago were preemptive enough in thinking about how this might affect Alaska. So if you think about earlier on that diagram of the relationship between the pathogen and the host species in the environment, it kind of shows a balance point in this case where things are endemic. If you've got an environmental shift like warmer winters, less spring snow, you can tip that balance in favor of the parasite to the detriment of the host species. So what our colleagues did 30 years ago was they looked at the potential for survival of winter ticks at 3 locations in Alaska. So they had some escape-proof situations. They looked at can these female engorge and go to the full reproductive, and the answer was yes on that, produce viable larvae. The conclusion is that if they became established, they could become established if they were introduced. And I see Amanda's given me 5 minutes. So the idea on that at that point, the early snow and later spring was probably a barrier, but climate change has since impacted tick ranges. So The concern now is that the host range has expanded in terms of mule deer. One thing we've got right now is with some of the climate weirding is even though it's kind of warmer up here, we do have later springs many years. There's some bad parts of that for ungulates, but it's good in case if we ever did get winter ticks up here. So if you see a ghost moose like this anytime between October and March, please let your local Fish and Game office know the best locations you can so they can hopefully get out and get some biological samples. So finally, I want to touch fairly briefly on the idea of biome shift. And this is where the shrub and forest is moving northward and westward and up in elevation. Parts of Alaska, you're very familiar with some of these vegetation changes. As Jeremy Littell mentioned, there is some change with fire risk that goes with this, where fire can then go into systems. A big thing that's with this is that it changes the snow distribution in the tundra, where it accumulates on the downwind side, and that has implications for positive feedback to vegetation, but also to wildlife as well. And another big factor occurring is beavers are spreading out into coastal tundra. So when you get beaver ponds, this water can also contribute to melting of permafrost. And again, all the vegetation changes by changing some of these balances of temperature and moisture. The thing to consider with this is that shrubs and trees really favor moose over a lot of the grazing species that feed on vegetation that's much lower to the ground. It's shading the grasses and forbs and the lichens, and so it's tipping this balance for the vegetation. And it's providing vertical structure. So you've got concealment for ambush predators like bears and wolves, which can especially prey on the calf segment of the population. The snow capture can be positive for insect relief if it remains into the insect season. But you then also, with the vertical structure, you got less wind near the ground, so more insect harassment. And one final thing is that when I try to anticipate what's going to be happening with habitat, it's some of these dramatic bumps that are in the road that Jeremy mentioned here. So an example is when the IPCC models first came out in the late 90s, they were talking about warmer, drier conditions. And we saw that in the central interior of Alaska. A lot of fire, we had drought stress on trees that a lot of ecologists were concerned about was really going to change some of the balance in the boreal forest species. And if you look at the changes in rainfall pattern, it's fairly dramatic. So these gray bars are a distribution of rainfall from 1930 to 2013. So you see that a lot of it falls during the growing season. But if you look now, what's changed is that since 2014, you've had a 30 to 50% increase in rainfall during the growing season. So this has a profound effect on the vegetation. So where you had a decade ago, this drought stress, now you've got all kinds of moisture. It's great for gardening, not so good for bees necessarily every year when it kind of stunts the fireweed. But the change in growing the fire fuels is going to be big, not only for habitat, but also for the human communities. And despite having more moisture, it's good we don't have fires now, but we are going to have droughts in the future. So this is just kind of a preparation for the other things that we're going to have to continue to try to adapt to. So I'm just going to leave you with this. I see that in terms of the big game species that are really important for subsistence, that this species, moose, is probably going to be favored going into the future that we see based on warming right now, whether it's warmer or drier. This species is probably going to be favored more to the detriment of caribou, for example. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tom. Really appreciate that talk. We're going to go ahead and move to our next speaker. And I appreciate everyone sticking with us for the talks. We've got one more talk, and then we will open it to question and answer. I see that a couple of folks are putting their questions in the chat window. That's totally fine. I'm going to try to keep track of those. But if you would like to put them in now, please put the presenter to which you're asking the questions. Otherwise, you can just hang on until the question and answer time, and then you can put your questions in at that point. I'm going to turn it over now to Doug Limpinsel. He's the Fisheries Biologist in the Habitat Conservation Delivery for NOAA Alaska Region. Go ahead, Doug. Thanks.
Hi, Amanda. You got this? The slide?
Looks great. Perfect.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Doug Limpinsel with NOAA Fisheries Habitat Conservation Division. John Morton asked me to touch on some of the changes we're seeing in Alaska's marine fisheries. I first want to acknowledge that I live in Eagle River, Alaska, the ancestral lands of the Dena'ina, and I appreciate them allowing me to share their land and want to also state that I often represent them in a lot of the discussions I'm involved in. With that, let's move forward. It's a tough act to follow, these guys, you know? There we go. Just to simply put this up there, no one part of an ecosystem is independent from any other part of an ecosystem, especially in the context of fisheries, water, and aquatic and marine processes. The atmosphere, riverine, estuarine, and marine processes are all closely connected and in some capacity influence the condition and the characteristics of the other. I won't belabor this. It's simple and clear, and Jeremy touched on it as well, but the Arctic ice pack is something we want to touch on as a feature that influences marine fisheries. Here simply is September 1984 versus September, or I'm sorry, yeah, 84 and September of 2016. A second feature that we need to touch on is atmospheric drivers. An increasing volume of literature is discussing the atmospheric influences, such as the Aleutian low pressure system, is historically providing much of the character for the Eastern Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska. Important to this discussion is the once historic presence of the frozen Arctic supports the strength of the Aleutian low in the winter and through the summer. But the presence of both systems support marine processes and fisheries. Let's get into the fish. But for those that are unfamiliar with the role of Arctic sea ice to fisheries in Alaska, let me explain. Historically, Arctic winter weather patterns, winds, building ice, density of ice volume, and the Coriolis effect, amongst several other drivers, push the Arctic ice into the Bering Sea in February, March, April, sometimes as far south as Bristol Bay, as shown in this slide. Beneath that sea ice, or within that sea ice, is ice algae, which is liberated into the upper water column in the days when the sunlight starts to lengthen in the early summer. Simultaneously, underneath the ice, especially in the Eastern Bering Sea, many species of groundfish are congregating and spawning, and their eggs and larval history stages are transported on currents into these shallower marine areas. As a result, the larvae and the juvenile phases of these fish are strategically positioned to receive all that very minuscule feed, algae, phytoplankton blooms. It all fuels the productivity and the abundance of invertebrate populations, forage fish populations, and the great abundance of marine groundfish populations that we see in Alaska. I borrowed this from Hunt. It's that illustration I just showed you is represented here in the late 70s, early 80s by this blue line here. Typically, that's where you would see this ice come down. And then in 2001 was one of the first really recognizable stanzas when the sea ice extent was greatly diminished. Then again, in 2008, you saw a cold period followed by another warming period, 2017, 2018. And then later, I think 2019 was even above that and around St. Lawrence. I think 2020, I haven't seen that data, but it's been a little bit, well, around St. Lawrence. Let's leave it there. I don't actually definitively know. What does that mean in terms of the fisheries? Those cold weather regimes, those cold weather stanzas essentially promote ice algae. They deliver the ice algae into the water column. It promotes larger plankton blooms. It fuels abundant copepod populations that are lipid rich. It's reflected in the condition of the fish. They're larger, more abundant, and they have a greater overwinter survival because they're not predating on each other. They have plenty of food. Where in those warm periods, those warm stanzas, you have less of the large lipid rich copepods and more of the small lipid poor copepods, which influences decreased abundance, decreased condition of fish, and doesn't support overwinter survival. A reflection, another feature, the third feature I wanted to touch on here was the cold pool. Essentially, a reflection of the sea ice is the benthic cold pool. On those years where they have the ice all the way down into Bristol Bay, you have this layer of benthic cold water between 0 and 2 degrees. It acts as a thermal layer and doesn't allow groundfish populations or intolerant groundfish populations to move north. Whereas in the years where you don't have that sea ice, you have this warmer temperature, and it essentially allows groundfish populations that are intolerant to the cold to move north. So recent research has clearly indicated that tagging data indicates clearly that different species are moving north. They've already crossed into the Bering Strait, depending on the time of the year. Genetic studies have also identified that. So there's a couple species that have moved north. Let's cross south into the Aleutian, below the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutian Islands. The warm blob, it's not unfamiliar to most of us. What's happening in the Gulf of Alaska, it's kind of similar to what's happening in the Bering Sea, but the mechanisms of the change that are influencing the trophic dynamics are slightly different. And let's touch on that. If I can find my cursor here. Didn't mean to make this busy, but I think it needs to be conveyed here that the driver that seems to be implementing the change is this fourth ecosystem feature, ocean mixing. I simply provide this illustration to illustrate the complexity of the topic. Part of the problem in the Gulf of Alaska is obviously increasing sea surface temperatures, partly because of a weakened Aleutian low and the influence of that prevailing high, or the prevailing Pacific high pressure system, which tends, well, in the case of the warm blob, has definitely dominated that system uncharacteristically out of season. So I borrow some research here from Dr. Barbeau at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. It's actually pretty simple. Here's a time series of temperatures in the Gulf of Alaska. You can see that the temperatures, though there's some variability, it stays within the mean. These yellow bands, vertical bands, their thickness indicates the time that the system stayed, the temperature stayed within that temperature. As you can see in the last couple of years, or since 2014 into 2020, that these bands have maintained their consistency. They're much thicker. And then into the summer of 2020, you can see that these bands were very prevalent. So this was into 2019 and 20, when actually they saw significant decreases in the populations of cod. How is that reflected in the cod? Here's a graph from one of the papers that came out of the Science Center that indicates the same timeline roughly. And you can see as we get into those latter 2000 or the 2014, 2020, the biomass of the spawning females available to recruit and put new cod into the water diminishes greatly. Essentially, this led to the shutdown of the fisheries. Now, if we jump back quickly to the Bering Sea, the firm stanza there was like from 2000, the warm stanza was from like 2002 to 2005 or 6. And you saw a crash in the pollock populations. And then there was a harvest reductions. Oftentimes the commercial fisheries had to move north to get to any kind of pollock that they could take to market. Whereas in the Gulf, it was predominant here, kind of fluctuated a little bit here, 2014 and 15, but there was clearly warming trends that stuck hard during this period, 2017 through 19.
5 minutes, Doug.
Very good. I'm done.
Yeah.
Essentially, what's been reflected is the mass mortality events that we've seen all over the state, and I target 2019 as the example, because from California all the way up to Nome and even north of that, I think north into the Bering, into the Chukchi Sea, we saw these mass mortality events of bivalves on the beach, invertebrates washing up on the beach in mass, not just a couple that you would expect to see, but large populations, entire populations taken out, which is reflected in the fish, which we don't have a lot of pictures of because they're usually consumed by something. But then the evidence is apparent in the seabirds and the marine mammals. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Rapid change is altering once fairly understood ecosystem processes, decreasing the precision needed to implement sustainable marine fisheries management measures in the future. And so that is something I keep pondering as we have these rad discussions and this conversation moves forward in the near couple of days. So with that, Amanda, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you so much, Doug. I appreciate you two also just leaving us on that last note. It's of the take-home point. That's a great way to communicate. And
any of the graphics I used here, I can make available to anybody. I've got all the websites and
great. And there's your email address right there. So we're going to start with some questions in the chat. We are transitioning now to a 15-minute Q&A session. And so I'm going to invite people to put questions in their chat and ask that are specific for presenters. Please identify the presenter to which you're asking the question. But let's start here with you, Doug. We have a question from Seal Smith, who says, how much does overfishing or other non-climate changes contribute to the decreased cod reproduction?
Could you repeat that? Overfishing and what? Climate change?
Or other non-climate changes. So how much does overfishing or other non-climate changes contribute to the decreased cod reproduction?
I don't think there's, it's kind of tough to say there's no, well, non-climate change. There's other anthropogenic drivers there that I haven't touched on here, including river discharge. And one of our previous announcers did touch on the changes in permafrost, which is definitely changing the chemistry of outwelling rivers. Overfishing. I'm gonna say this one as being once an observer out there. I've had experience in both coasts, and the Alaska. I'm gonna say this plug for the fisheries first. Alaska fisheries management, the marine systems, is probably the best on the planet. We still maintain the bar. Most other places in the world consult with our Alaska Fisheries Science Center or our Fisheries Council when they need to implement similar management efforts. However, I will say this: if we did, now I'm a fisherman to a certain extent, not commercially. I dip net. I use gear. I like keeping fish in the freezer. My kids enjoy it. I harvest fish. It's a huge economy up here. Would it behoove us to start to draw back on some of that harvest? The reality is, well, there's a lot of people in different agencies that don't want to hear that, but the reality is, if we left more population in the water, the populations would probably be more resilient to change. And so, does that kind of touch on the question? I hope that kind of answered the question. And the answer is, we're not in an overfishing scenario. However, our fishing right now is making the populations a little more susceptible to change. I think that answers it responsibly.
Great, thanks, Doug. We got some questions coming in here. I'm going to go back. Catherine Buchanan asked, I believe this is for you, John Morton. I was looking at the cost of Miami beaches that cost millions every time a hurricane touches ground. Would building floating homes similar to those in Norway be a feasible idea?
I'm always a little concerned kind of getting involved in the human side of the business because, you know, mine is all about landscape and ecological processes. But the little bit I do know about different ways of constructing, yeah, I mean, I would say yes, but I'm ignorant about Norway's houses, truthfully. Someone else in the audience may have, or someone else on the panel may have a better thought on that.
Yeah, great. Well, let's go. I'm trying to get to as many people's questions as we can. So Steele Smith asked a question to Tom Paragi. Is there a link to Lyme tick vectors, and what are the risks of these parasites jumping to human populations?
Did you say Lyme disease?
Yes.
I'd have to ask Dr. Beckman about that. I'm not aware that that's an issue around Alaska. Those types of tick, it's a different type of tick, and they're not this far north. So it's not something that's been on our radar. That particular tick is not up here that I'm aware of.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom. Doug, when you were asking if if you answered Steele's question, she said yes. Thank you. She was thinking commercial, not subsistence. Okay. Also for Doug from Aldehyde Herman, do you have any comments on what may be happening to the downturn in the Chignik fishery?
I can't say. I'm probably the POC on that. No, I don't. Is that groundfish or is that salmon? I think that's, yeah. So I'm across
salmon.
I can easily speak to salmon as well as groundfish, but I think one of the state representatives would be a better touch on that. I think one thing that I don't see a lot of science being drawn in on is salmon are a unique species. They actually meet us humans at their most susceptible life history stage, as they're adults and dying, and then they leave their embryos in the gravel and overwinter. I don't think a lot of people are paying enough attention to what's going on in the watersheds, because I think if the watersheds are changing that dramatically, water chemistry, hyporheic groundwater, surface water, and the chemistry from permafrost is changing those spawning beds and those overwinter embryo hyporheic zones, I think there's potential there for a lot of impacts. So that even if adults are getting up there and spawning, those embryos aren't surviving through the winter. Possibly. I don't see anybody talking about that. The rest of the salmon discussion, I can see everybody's points of view, from the subsistence and the commercial points of view, but I think Chignik specifically is probably best a question for ADF&G.
Great, thanks, Doug. We're going to jump to Kelsey Hansen's question, and maybe there's someone from ADF&G that can answer that, but let's make sure we can get through everyone's questions first, and then we can loop back to that if there's time at the end. Kelsey asked to John Morton, how far back do we go in history to determine historic levels in the resist concept?
You know, as I said when I presented, that it is kind of arbitrary and it depends on who's doing the asking. So, you know, I'll give you an example from a very legal perspective, and I think this is going to be touched on a little bit later here about wood bison introductions in Alaska. It's an almost, I don't want to say arbitrary, but there is a line that's drawn around the perceived distribution of wood bison in, I think, the mid 1800s, and that is from an endangered species reintroduction effort. That is the line that they're using to determine historic distributions. You know, when I talk about bison down on the Kenai, there hasn't been any observations there, you know, in recent times being multiple centuries, but we had, you know, steppe bison on the Kenai 40,000 years ago, and we have fossil records of that, and horns have been found. So it just depends on who's doing the asking and what the context is. I don't mean to fluff that off, but it's true. I think one of the more important points of that question, though, is when you're talking to somebody about historic context, you got to nail them and ask them specifically what period of time you're talking about.
Great, thank you so much for that. Nicole Schmitt asked a question for Doug. You're just repeating what Aldehide put in there. So sorry, Nicole, I thought you had a question, but we've already addressed that. So we have another question here, and you can put it in the chat window. There's also a Q&A portion at the bottom of the screen. You can do either one. I'm monitoring them both. Linda Shaw asked if anyone, so this is open to the whole group, does anyone have thoughts on ocean acidification?
I do. Obviously, it's going to be an issue in the future. I think essentially, again, touching on permafrost melt. If we look at the level of additional elements that are being discharged into rivers right now, carbon in the Arctic and the Yukon, that melt of permafrost is contributing a lot of carbon and nitrogen to the system. So again, I don't think there's a lot of research being done to address that. So it is an issue. I think in the bigger picture, the oceans are still absorbing a lot of carbon. So there is changes. There's these pulses happening. You'll see an increase in acidification and changes in pH here and here. But the ocean is such a dynamic system. It's like a flash in the pan. It happens, there's measurement, it's gone. And it changes seasonally, it can change daily depending on currents and tides. So it's a very flashy thing that's happening. And there's some places where you can see some subtle increases. I would say beyond that, I wouldn't want to go too deeply into it. I've looked at it several times and I don't see anything that really sticks yet. However, it's going to. There's no question about it.
Jeremy or anyone else, would you like to weigh in?
Only that it's an example of what I was talking about, in that the impacts that we see in interior Alaska in a terrestrial environment, then feed through all the way through the hydrologic system and out into the marine environment, and they have very complicated downstream impacts that are surprising to us when we initially see them. And when we think about those larger contexts of the decisions that we make about R or A or D or something in between or among them, then it's a much more complicated set of responses that may occur given our actions. So it's clear that nature is providing us with all kinds of examples of how those work, and the more we know about it, the better off we are.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for weighing in. So Ben Botger has a question for John. You said the objective of RAD should be a self-sustaining, self-organizing state that doesn't require perpetual management. Can you give an example of where resistance or direction has achieved this state? How should managers envision or target these states?
Yeah, in RAD, we separated out as a subset of general management, the conventional land and wildlife population management that we do. We kind of separated out intervention. And intervention, we're using it very explicitly in the RAD context to mean intervening in the ecological trajectory through resisting, accepting, directing. So when I talk about, making it sort of try to make it as best we can a steady state system, we really are talking about removing intervention, but not necessarily management. And so in that, when you look for an example, I mean, the reality is most of our systems, a lot of our systems in the US in general, and specifically Alaska, I mean, they're all self-sustaining to a certain point, even in a climate changing world. But of course, at some point that starts to unravel. And of course, that's the conversation we're having here, is that they have been self-sustaining without any intervention and hardly any management other than, putting out fires. And, and that's really the point, but the discussion here is that it is changing and we will have to start envisioning, alternative states.
Thanks, John. We've got 3 minutes left, and one question here that just came in is from Erin Shu, and it's a longer answer than 3 minutes we'll allow, so maybe we can talk about it during the panel discussion. But she asked, how do you come to consensus over resist versus accept versus direct in the planning and decision-making process? If you are taking management actions to resist or direct, when or how do you decide when an attempt is or isn't working? Especially for projects estimated to cost millions and take decades of interventions, how do you get the funding and political will for experiments like that? Is this why managers tend to default to accepting or studying changes?
Whew, that's a good one for the panel. I'm going to kind of bump.
Go, John.
Yeah, that's a tough one, and it's like any planning process. It depends on who your stakeholders are. And in fact, I don't even like to use that term stakeholders anymore because this is being so societally driven. I mean, the future we're envisioning doesn't really have any kind of an analog. And I don't like that word stakeholders. I like to talk about our partners and society at large. And, this is where we can start getting into issues of governance, right? That are much bigger than the discussion we're having here today about RAD, because I think there are alternative governance discussions that need to happen to make this kind of thing evolve properly.
Yeah, great. Doug, you have your hand raised?
To back John on this, I would answer the question also saying it's very situational. I mean, you got to scale and scope. A watershed on the Kenai is probably much more receivable by the public or actually handleable. Like you can actually controllability is an issue we've recently discussed in RAD, whereas influencing sea ice in the Bering Sea, probably not so much. And so it's very situational.
Great. So Diane Granfors, I'm going to introduce you in a minute, but if you want to go ahead and get your slides teed up, I just want to mention that we did, so excuse me, Catherine, I missed your question earlier. Has there been a study to link the exacerbation of the drought to the removal of the groundwater by mining activities? If we can answer that in like 30 seconds or less, that would be, if anyone has a quick answer, otherwise we can put it in the parking lot.
I can touch on that, not specifically. However, there are people that are looking at that. The connection between groundwater, surface water, and the very invasive dewatering of groundwater regimes and its reflection on surface waters. It's being looked at. So, but it's not an easy exercise. And so if you're taking water from both the surface and climate change and increasing temperatures, and you're dewatering a watershed at the same time, it's obviously going to have impacts to salmon.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Doug. I'm going to leave it there. I know there's a lot we could talk about, but I want to make sure we save enough time for the next block of presenters. Just like we did earlier, we're going to go through a block of presenters and then have another 15 minutes of question and answer at the end of their presentation. So please write down your questions. You can put them into the chat, but I'll try to monitor them, but I can't promise because it might get lost in the shuffle. So if you wait until the end, it might be a little bit easier, but it's up to you. And Nikki and I are going to just try to tag team to make sure we answer your questions. Next up, we have Jim Lawler and Diane Granfors, the National Park Service Alaska Region lead for the Inventory and Monitoring Program. And Diane is the Inventory and Monitoring Coordinator for Alaska Refuges and the U.S. Fisheries Service. So Jim, I believe you're going first. So go ahead when you're ready. We see your slides.
Great, thank you. Well, I can, I think, do away with the introduction since you did such a fine job, Amanda. I will acknowledge that both Diane and I live and work on the traditional lands of the Dena'ina. And what we're going to do this morning is we're going to give you a brief overview of two Alaska long-term monitoring programs, ecological monitoring programs. And We acknowledge that long-term monitoring has been happening for on these traditional lands for generations. And the next slide. So I'm going to talk about the NPS I&M program, and it's a long-term monitoring program with like a 50-year timescale to measure and report on the status and trends of a subset measures of the ecological health of a park. It's also a way of doing business, of organizing and reporting on the conditions of resources, regardless of who collects the data. It could be the Park Service or it could be somebody else. It can traditionally be broken down into two efforts: an inventory, which is determining the current condition of a resource, or monitoring park ecosystems to determine the status and trends and conditions of a resource. Go to the next slide. Nationwide, the Park Service, when they stood up the inventory and monitoring program, they grouped all 240 parks in the National Park Service into 32 ecologically similar networks to enhance efficiency and local decision-making. 4 of these networks are located in Alaska. So the Arctic network, depicted in purple at the top of the screen, the Central Alaska network in interior Alaska, here depicted in orange, the Southwest Alaska network, depicted in green, and then the Southeast Alaska network, depicted in blue. Next one. As I mentioned, the NPS I&M program measures and reports on a subset of metrics that are indicative of the ecological health of parks. These metrics, which are referred to as vital signs, were established through a process depicted in this kind of busy slide, starting with the consultation of park managers, superintendents, and natural resource leads, subject matter experts. And from that process, they ranked a series of ecological metrics called or vital signs. They piloted some work and eventually established protocols by which these vital signs are monitored. Periodically, the vital signs are reviewed to ensure that they are meeting the objectives identified in the protocols and that they remain relevant to the parks. Go to the next one. Another busy slide, but you may be wondering what the NPS is monitoring, what the vital signs are. And this slide shows all the vital signs that were ranked or identified as important in each network. And then the ones in bold are the ones where the networks are actually working on monitoring that particular vital sign in some form or another. But there's a few themes. We can kind of simplify this slide quickly by saying there's a few themes, and they are climate or climate change, wildlife populations, contaminants, and water quality. And those are measured or monitored in all the parks. And then there's an accountability aspect, and that's what this one is showing. So the far left, there's a protocol that's been established for monitoring a particular vital sign, along with SOPs. There's a regular reporting schedule for reporting out on this, either in technical reports or peer-reviewed manuscripts. And then on the far right, we've got what you could call the elevator speech, a one-page front and back, making it easy for busy people to digest what's being monitored in a particular network. And I'll turn it over to Diane.
Okay, can folks hear me okay? I'm on phone, which I've never done before, so.
Yeah, we hear you. Great, thanks.
Okay, thanks. So the I&M program for the National Wildlife Refuge system got started in 2010 with the focus on providing science and planning support for adaptive management. So the goals listed here are step down from the national program. We want to make sure that refuges have and collect the information they need to support their decisions. We provide biometric support for science rigor and technical assistance for data management. And we help to partner for partnerships and communication among refuges and with our partners, both within and outside the Fish and Wildlife Service. So this is a word cloud that's based on the titles for refuge surveys, and it gives you an idea of where individual refuges focus their efforts. You can see a large number of surveys are focused on monitoring population trends for subsistence species. We can see a lot of monitoring of moose, caribou, and salmon that help inform decisions regarding harvest. There's also a lot of attention given to migratory birds, which are trust species for the refuges. And there's a focus on productivity of breeding waterfowl and seabirds. And then there's also just a really wide variety of things that are addressed, such as inventories, vegetation, plant surveys, depending on the individual needs of the refuge. To address the goals of the I&M branch, which is regional in nature, we've supported gathering the baseline data that are needed to help interpret what is on our refuges, such as the IFSAR, which was an Alaska-wide effort to get accurate and precise elevation data. And then that in turn informs other baseline data such as NWI, NHD, and land cover. We also support on-the-ground baseline data with vegetation surveys to further our knowledge of our habitats, and we support the Alaska Landbird Monitoring Survey, or OLMS, to monitor land birds. As I mentioned before, data management is a large part of our efforts. There's a large focus both nationally and regionally to do a better job with data management, making our data accessible and discoverable. And partnerships are required for all of this. But one example in particular is the Pacific Seabird Program, which is an I&M sponsored program to coordinate seabird monitoring and data management across the Pacific.
Diane, you got 5 minutes.
A big, whoa.
Sorry, you got
Okay.
5 minutes.
So I'll just run through this quickly. We're really in a big planning process right now for individual refuges. It starts with identifying our priority resources of concern, developing objectives, and leading to an inventory and monitoring plan. And then we get to what we call implementing the plan, which is not just getting out into the field, it's also developing a protocol and making sure that's vetted. And so these planning efforts help us decide where we can resist changes such as development, where we have to accept things like permafrost thaw, and maybe how we can direct certain things happening on the land, such as wildfire. And we can do this through adaptive management, and everybody's seen some version of the plan, do, learn cycle. And yeah, it's just the way we do business conservation. I'll turn it back to Jim.
Okay, so hopefully you all picked up that there was a lot of similarities between the National Park Service I&M program and the Fish and Wildlife Service program. A few key points. First one is that parks and refuges tend to be pretty young in Alaska in comparison to our friends in the lower 48. So typically we don't have the wealth of data sets, long-term data sets they might have in the lower 48. There's an emphasis on protocols, so it's establishing a written accountable protocol that is followed in order to monitor, increase the rigor of what we're looking at. Diane mentioned IFSAR and land cover mapping, which are kind of baseline information. Both programs focus on baseline information that feed into more complex studies. Planning. So we've got the long-term monitoring plan, the parks do, and the Fish and Wildlife Service has the refuge resources of concern. And in both programs, there was an upfront investment in things like data management and survey design. As Diane mentioned, we can't do these monitoring programs without partnerships. So we leverage all kinds of partnerships where we can, from USGS to universities to the state of Alaska and others. And Diane already covered the full life cycle from envisioning and project design all the way to reporting out and publishing the results in technical reports. or other documents. So what can these programs deliver that is relevant for the participants of this workshop? I will highlight one example. A few years ago, some of my colleagues in the Central Alaska Network published a paper about elevational shifts in Denali's passerine bird community relative to vegetation changes in the same area. They looked at changes in the elevational distribution of 17 bird species from 1995 to 2013, so about a nearly 20-year record. And they looked at this across an elevational gradient that also captured shifts in ecotones, including tree line and shrub line. We'll go to the next. What they found was an upward shift among shrub tundra bird species and also an expansion of shrub cover to higher elevation. Forest-associated birds showed a weaker and more varied response in regards to their distribution. Along with this, the mean summer temperature in Denali increased significantly over the past century, but was stable over the study period. Taken collectively, this implies that long-term changes in climate influence bird distribution through changes in woody distribution. The variable responses of forest-associated bird species was consistent with a slower rate of forest expansion as compared with the shrub tundra birds associated with a more consistent shrub colonization of higher elevations. This ecological story was stitched together through long-term monitoring of passerine birds, vegetation, and weather and climate. I think this is the type of basic information that can inform the resist, accept, and direct framework.
1 minute left, Jim.
It's back to Diane.
So yeah, just another example of a partnership program is we collaborated with Audubon to look at how bird communities might change in parks and refuges. And here you can see the number of species that are estimated to colonize a refuge in blue and disappear in red, and those in yellow are stable. But you can see there is predicted to be a large ecological transformation with a lot of species turnover in the summer months and a lot of winter colonization or birds sticking around through the winters in Alaska. Another collaboration project that we're a big part of is water temperature monitoring. Every one of these dots represents a partner contributing to the Alaska Online Aquatic Temperature Site, or OATS. So this is just, some examples of how we're using monitoring to find out what the future is for our conservation lands in Alaska. But we do need the partner input. We need landscape scale thinking in order to move forward to figure out where we should be accepting and what those alternatives might be. So thanks.
Great, thank you so much to both of you. That's a pretty impressive tag team going back and forth, especially with the limited time. So great job to both of you. It's a really informative presentation. Next up, we have Matt Bowser, who is a fish and wildlife biologist at the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Looks good, Matt. But we can't hear you, or at least I can't. Anyone else having a hard time hearing Matt, or is it just me?
Got it.
Okay, perfect. Oh, now you're muted. There we go.
Right now?
Oh, good.
Okay, good. All right, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here virtually with you. So I have a very simple, I've been asked to give a very simple thesis here, which is that in order to make good decisions, like the decisions we're talking about here, we really should know what's going on. There's really, we can, and there are ways now to understand what biodiversity is, even right now. But first, I want to acknowledge that I live in Kasilof and work on the Kenai Refuge. on lands that have a long and rich history of management by people that have been here a long time. So my point here is very straightforward. It's that the things that we have long focused on the things that are easy to see and identify because it's easy and because we can. But things have changed in the last decade where we're not limited that way anymore. We really can have a much better understanding of what we have now. And that's only going to get better in the future. So this is the biologist to me. I'm showing, these are pictures of morels from the Kenai Peninsula we identified this last year based on DNA sequences. So 6 species from the Kenai, we only knew about 1 before, that's fun. So we're picking these up in the soil. But I'm going to focus not on fungi, but on invertebrates, because that's what I know, that's my bread and butter. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to convince you that invertebrates are important. There are good reasons to believe that this 6th extinction is affecting invertebrates very much, and they matter a lot. And that's something I don't have to argue very much here in Alaska, as we can look out the window here and there are dying spruce trees or dead spruce trees, like what John mentioned earlier. They are the agents here of landscape change, so they matter very much. So why, if they're so important, why haven't we dealt with them in the past, besides just not being as charismatic? What it really comes down to is that they're just too hard to work with. They have long been almost impossible to get, or just prohibitively expensive to get good identifications on. It's hard to even know what you've got because it takes a great deal of time and money to learn much about them. So this is just an illustration of conventional workflow of what we've done in the past. So we would go out and collect a sample to understand what a community looks like. And when we get back to the lab, each one of those samples, we'd have to pin each specimen and often dissect them, look at them under a microscope, and often send them around the world to different experts for identification. And then we would get what we were after in the beginning, which is just a list of the species that were part of that community. But there's some serious problems with it, as you can get identifications on some specimens even after a bunch of time and money has been spent. But there will be many things that were part of that community that you will miss because they might have been immature or damaged specimens, and you'll never be able to get a name on them. And it's quite a large proportion of your specimens that are that way. I want to contrast that with, this is a quick illustration of a metabarcoding or metagenomic method or workflow. And in this case, we'll take same kind of a sample, a community sample, and instead of dealing with each specimen, we will grind them up and extract the DNA from that slurry. And I'm going to skip a bunch of steps here, but we'll be looking at, we'll be amplifying that DNA and looking at a very short piece of DNA, that's our DNA barcode, from a lot of different organisms. That's the meta part of metabarcoding, is that it's not just one organism. We are sequencing at the same time, potentially millions of reads from a small number of samples or a large number of samples, and then processing all that in parallel. So it's done on supercomputers, and in our case, we're doing it through a commercial service. We'll just taking vials of specimens and sending them off to a commercial lab, and which does this routinely. And they'll do the sequencing and send back to us. At the end, what we get is a list of all the sets of sequences that were in those samples, and they're tagged for each sample, so we know which samples they came from. And then we have to deal with that alphabet soup of DNA sequences. And what we do is we compare those to libraries that we've made already. So we've identified things in the past, and there's the databases are getting better and better. We can compare the sequences we get with what we already know and get identifications on those specimens. So I just want to give you an example. This is a single specimen or a single sample And this is from a pike project on the Kenai Refuge this last summer, where along with Fish and Game, we worked to eradicate a population of invasive northern pike by applying rotenone. But when you do that, you also kill a lot of the invertebrates. So it's good practice to survey for invertebrates before and afterward, which is a pretty routine thing to do. But in this case, we used metagenomic methods, metabarcoding. So this is a plankton sample. I chose it just because I have pretty pictures of it I took in the field. It's a vial of little crustaceans mostly. And from that, we were able to get a bunch of names here. These are some of the most abundant sequences in that sample. And one thing I like about this illustration is I don't know much about plankton. I could not have identified these on my own, but then I get several reliable names of species that should be common here. But also, if you look at the first couple names, they're not species names. There are these, I've come up with the names for these taxonomic units, but we get a lot of these where there are sequences that we don't have a name for. They don't line up with anything in the databases, and that's not bad. That's because there probably are something that are not in the databases. Nobody's sequenced that before, and in these cases, they are very abundant in the sample, and I have high confidence that they are really there. We can't put a name on them now, but we can recognize them in the future if we see them again, which we are seeing things like that. So the naming is not a limitation. We can identify just based on sequences. So scaling up to a little bigger example, this is something we did, kind of a pilot study in 2016, where we're just employing pretty typical monitoring methods on 40 sites right around Kenai Refuge headquarters in the woods. We went to 40 different sites, sampled using lots of methods, but including metagenomics for invertebrates. And just from those 40 sites, it was 125 samples that we sent off. We picked up 671 species resolution identifications of invertebrates. But here's the astonishing part is that 102 of those were new records for Alaska. And we keep pretty good records of what we've got in Alaska through collaboration with Derek Sykes at UAM, University of Alaska Museum. So that was surprising. But every time we do this, we find new records. And a lot of it is because we don't have the same limitations or the same biases. We don't overlook nor the immature specimen or even parasites. Everything that's in there gets sequenced. And so we get a lot more names that we would have otherwise overlooked. But what I want to highlight here is that we already see a changed landscape, a changed set of communities. There were invasive species, including this birch leaf miner, that were not native. So we're already picking them up in the broader landscape, and we're already seeing change even in our time one survey. And this is a slide of mixed data from Kenai Refuge and Tetlin. Some of it's metagenomic data, others, and some of it's collected other ways. But the point I'm trying to make here is that you can scale up very easily. You're not limited by as much by sample size. So because you're processing everything in parallel, it doesn't, as you increase your sample size, your workload per sample goes down. That's just an efficiency system.
You have 5 minutes now.
Consistent with all those new records for Alaska, whenever you sample this way, you're going to find surprises because there are things that you just wouldn't pick up other ways, at least very easily. And this is just one example from that the data set right around refuge headquarters, where we picked up this little braconid wasp that is a species that was previously only known from Ontario. And in Canada, it's a species of conservation concern because there are only a handful of specimens ever collected, and they're all from Ontario. Well, we picked it up here, which implies that it has a much bigger range, possibly. And whether or not this is true, in case we have an error or something, it still shows that you're going to pick up things that are completely unexpected, and it'll change your perspective. This very quickly changes your perspective on this species. And there are other surprises. So this is this is an example. So this is the kind of thing that I like. This is why I'm an entomologist and why I'm a biologist. I love learning about things. So this is part of the pike project again, where we were surveying in a lake that was being treated for pike. And this is from a benthic sample. We're just picking up dredging material from the bottom. And in that sample, we had thrown in sponge, freshwater sponge, because that is an animal. And we did get on our results in our metagenomic sequences. We did pick up plenty of sponge DNA, but we also picked up this little animal, which is a spongilla fly, and it happens to be the first record of the species from Alaska. And I would love to go back and find some of these alive. Right now, I just have some ACs, Ts, and Gs from it, just some sequences, but it was probably in or on the sponge, or could have been an egg on the sponge, I'm not sure. But this is just an illustration showing that we're going to find things that you don't expect. It's a very sensitive method. But what I want to leave you with is that this isn't new anymore. It was in 2012, 2015 when I got started. These methods were more cutting edge then, although the bacteria and fungi folks have been doing it for a little longer. For arthropods, it was pretty new, for invertebrates. But it's not cutting edge anymore. Like I said, I'm sending samples out to a commercial lab. And it's a routine already, and the methods are already good enough for understanding a lot of the biodiversity that's out there. So there's no reason to wait anymore. The technology is already there, and it's still improving. And just because it's improving doesn't mean we need to wait. We can already have an opportunity to understand what's out there right now. But the
1 minute, Matt.
Thank you. Is a newer platform. It's been out several years now, where sequencing can be done in the field. This is a $1,000 sequencer that connects to a laptop by USB, and it does metagenomics, among other things. Just making the case that this is now much more equitable. It's out there. It's not something that only fancy DNA labs can do, but it's something that's available at the practitioner, like mine, level. Right, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. That's such a fascinating approach that you all have been doing on the Kenai. I appreciate you sharing it with us today. We're going to be moving on. We're going to stay on the Kenai. We're going to pass the torch here to Don Magnus, a landscape ecologist at Kenai National Wildlife Refuge.
Do you have my screen, Amanda?
Yep, we see your screen. It just, we don't see presenter mode. There it goes.
Beautiful. Okay, thanks. Yeah, sometimes I have two screens and sometimes they switch back and forth. So I'm always a little bit looking at that. Yeah, so I just want to give my appreciation to everybody who has talked and is participating in this workshop. I'm going to talk about managing connectivity to accept change, also from the Kenai Peninsula, where I want to, give my thanks to the Dena'ina and Aleutian people for stewarding this beautiful land for a very long time and continuing to do so into the future. My talk is going to focus on just walking you through connectivity for climate adaptation, some ideas about how to do it climate smart, and then give 3 case studies where, thinking about connectivity occurs at different spatial scales, since I am a landscape ecologist. And so climate, adaptation, has been a big topic of discussion for the last 15 years. And as we think about a changing climate, species have moved in response to climate change in the paleo record. And so we know that animals, this is one way that they adapt and cope to changes like climate change. And because of that, connectivity rises again and again as a widely suggested climate adaptation strategy. And especially since it's a low risk strategy, keeping intact in connected landscapes makes sense even without change. But given change, it's a low risk strategy and we know how to do it. And we have been thinking about ways to do it even as climate changes, by focusing on things that are enduring. And I'm going to make the argument that two of those are topography. And although, you know, we can change land use, that land use is also another thing that we can think about as a feature that we can plan for connectivity around. And that acknowledgement of land use ties back to ANILCA in 1980. This was legislation that carved out very large refuges and parks, as well as BLM and other federal lands. And this was because in the 1980s, people were thinking about ecological function and thinking about how to set up federal lands that would protect ecological function and allow people to live on the land in sustainable ways, not only for us, but for future generations, so for our children. And so we have these large intact landscapes in Alaska, and we have these large parks and refuges, which we can think of as the conservation estate. So places where we're not going to put strip malls and Western development. And we can think about connecting those places, but it's a lot of, it's not passive, right? Maintaining connectivity is hard work, but it's still in the RAD framework and accept strategy. And I was recently in a review process for a paper where one of my reviewers kept going, you know, conserving nature's stage and some of these approaches to build resilient and connected conservation networks. This reviewer kept going, it's a lot of work. How can it be accept? And it's accept because we're doing this hard work so that plants and animals can respond autonomously to climate change, so they can resort without our hand, you know, shaping the outcomes. There's been a lot of work about how to work on connectivity in ways that are climate smart. And there's two general approaches. The first, where I'm going to focus on more, is this idea of there are enduring features, such as topography or geodiversity. And that if we can link and protect those features, that's the stage that will allow the actors, which are species, to respond autonomously. So if we can provide them a place to be, they can sort themselves and resort under climate changes. So that's the first way. And here's and in this example, the map is an example of the second. The second tries to do things where we're looking at climate and climate projections to connect the historical climate with the future climate. So this is an example of a climate velocity method, but you can see the corridors emerging out of that. Also climate envelope models. One critique of this approach is that then you have to think about the uncertainty that comes across the range of future projections from the climate models. And so that's why in my examples, I'm going to focus on an enduring feature approach and at 3 scales. So this is an example of the first scale, which is Alaska or large scale planning, where we were trying to think about parks and refuges as the conservation reserve and thinking about how partners like the BLM in their resource management planning, which is a multi-jurisdictional plan, if we could ask them as part of that multi-jurisdictional planning to think about connectivity for these core conservation areas, which are the parks and refuges. And we used a geodiversity approach to identify where those landscape linkages might be between these conservation units. And I just want to acknowledge that this was, you know, multi-stakeholder work. And so the Northwest Boreal Landscape Conservation Cooperative, now the Northern Latitude Partnership, how important it was for them to have that convening space for people to talk to one another. In this approach, it was just based on topography, so we only needed a DM to do it. So we could think about different ridges, slopes, and canyons in terms of, are they hot? Are they high elevation or low elevation? Is it steep or not? And we used a clustering algorithm, this is called land faucets analysis, to think about the diversity that we have in terms of topography on the landscape in this 60 million acre planning area. And then we could use the least cost path modeling to think about if we could create landscape linkages that would accommodate all those different geodiversity types, and saying, okay, we know species are going to resort based on change. We can't necessarily predict how that's going to look, but we can assume that things that like hot, dry, high elevation slopes, that they'll be able to find similar places, as you know, because we're connecting these features. And it's one interesting outcome of this. So this is a paper that was published in Landscape Ecology, was when we thought about it in this way, we could ask BLM to think about 1% of the planning area, but it would connect over 64 million acres of conservation land. And this one in particular just floors me. I'm gonna switch screens so I can use my pointer, but this piece of land here, and there's roads, but thinking about connectivity there, it's an 8-mile bridge that connects millions and millions of acres of lands, basically the entire Brooks Range. And BLM, you know, the things that they think about in their planning will be highly influential to keeping these lands porous amongst each other. The second example I'm going to drop into is thinking about connectivity at a regional scale. And so this is this Kenai Peninsula. And we are, you know, at the Alaska scale, we're always thinking about how we are a peninsula geography, how, you know, we don't have some small mammals like flying squirrels just because they haven't made it across the isthmus, which is 11 miles long. And so at that larger scale of connectivity, always thinking about how things might not be able to naturally disperse onto a peninsula, but then we do have the roads. And so things are coming in on tire wheels. So how does our geography affect connectivity? And then also thinking about connectivity within this region of the Kenai Peninsula. And that connectivity doesn't have to be terrestrial. There's also, we have a project called Mountains to Sea, where we're thinking about the connectivity of salmon streams. And so thinking about our 386, 5 miles and of river outlet, of river miles, and that when we just think, because of the way the land use is, the federal estate shown here is peeled back from the coast. And so if we think about those streams that cross from private and other lands onto the federal estate, there's 22 outlets. But if we think about the mouths of those rivers, we can provide connectivity for over 50% of our salmon streams. And so that might be a place to think about investment, or perhaps tax breaks for those landowners, for them to be good stewards of that land. How can we positively incentivize people to think about how their property is so important for salmon stream connectivity? And this is the last final quick example of another way of, I'm calling it local landscape connectivity, but also that we are thinking about landscape connectivity within the refuge. And this is the Sterling Highway that bisects the refuge north and south. And thinking about these enduring features also helped us when a highway project came in, and they're expanding the highway from 2 lanes to 4. And this highway, you know, some roads in Alaska are no big deal. This one has a car every 1 to 4 seconds in the summer. So it's a highway where it can be hard to walk across as a human, much less, you know, an animal. But it's become constrained because the development or the lands where there are people are in yellow. We have these huge lake features. And then there's really only a few places, looking at the topography, bumping around between Ski Lac Lake and the development, coming at the foothills of the Kenai Mountains, and then up these valleys. And we could think about how to keep these connections to the north and south. And so when this highway planning was happening, John Morton was integral in this, negotiating with Department of Transportation to ask them for bigger culverts for bears. And then there was a lot of things he did, but in the Kenai Refuge staff did, but thinking about, because, culverts aren't great for moose and caribou. So choosing a place where we would make a big ask for a bridge. So this culvert here was the old culvert turning into this expansive area where caribou, moose, and other animals can pass under the highway without being a danger to themselves or human travelers. And so this is where I will end with this thought. This is a picture from one of our camera stations that refuge staff are monitoring to see how these infrastructures are working, to links going across. And just to leave you with that message that, connectivity is accept because we're allowing plants and animals to respond, but that it's still challenging and hard because we have to ask these questions. Where are we going to do this multi-jurisdictional planning, and how do we decide who's responsible for thinking about these things, as they're often in between lands or crossing multiple lands? And so that's where I will end. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dawn. And what a great photo to end on. That's an amazing.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it's really cool. Super cool. Great. Well, thanks so much for that. Next, we have queued up Erin Knoll. She's with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Alaska Region, where she is the Endangered Species Coordinator. Take it away, Erin.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. Get this going. It's funny, I use Teams all day and you guys ask me to use Zoom and suddenly I have no idea what I'm doing.
Totally. We can see your slides, so you're doing great.
All right. That did not start it, did it? Okay. Oh,
you're good.
Just move you. Okay. Well, thank you all for having me. I'm excited to be here. This has been a great morning so far, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the week. As Amanda mentioned, I'm Erin Knoll, the Regional Endangered Species Coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Alaska. I live and work in the lands of the Dena'ina people in what is now Anchorage, Alaska. However, I'm currently sitting in the lands of the Kawawiltuken, Humanos, Comanche, and Tankawa people in Austin, Texas, just for the winter. I'm taking a little break from Alaska. So this talk is titled Management of Threatened and Endangered Species in Alaska in the Face of Climate Change. And I'm just going to give a brief overview of the Endangered Species Act, discuss the species that are currently listed in Alaska, what climate change means for them, and then what does listed species management look like in Alaska in the face of climate change. So the purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to protect and recover imperiled species and the ecosystems that they depend upon. It's administered by both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Commerce's National Marine Fisheries Service, also called NIMFS. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has primary responsibilities for terrestrial and freshwater organisms, including polar bears, sea otters, manatees, and walrus, which are not listed. NIMFS has responsibilities for marine wildlife, such as whales, seals, sea lions, and anadromous fish. Although if those anadromous fish are in freshwater, then the Fish and Wildlife Service has responsibility. Additionally, species can be jointly managed, such as sea turtles or those anadromous fish. So this talk is going to primarily focus on the Fish and Wildlife Service species. However, I'm going to present you guys with the NIMFS listed species too, and I had to look this up. So we operate pretty independently, but this is just a quick list of the NIMFS listed species. As you can see, there's a lot of whales. They do have the Arctic ring seal, a bearded seal, Steller sea lion, and DPS is a distinct population segment, and it's a smaller portion of the species. So a smaller portion is listed. So the sea turtle, all 4 species of sea turtles, loggerhead, green, leatherback, and olive ridley, may randomly occur in Alaska, as well as there are numerous anadromous fish that are listed in the lower 48 that spawn on the West Coast, and during their marine phase, they may make it up into Alaskan waters. And there's a comprehensive list on their website, and that's actually where I pulled this list. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as I mentioned, one of our authorities is the Endangered Species Act, and there are 5 threatened species and 3 endangered species listed in Alaska. And those threatened species are polar bear, wood bison, spectacled eider, 2 mouthfuls, the Southwest Alaska DPS of the northern sea otter, and then the Alaska breeding population DPS of Steller's eider. And then our 3 endangered species are short-tailed albatross, Eskimo curlew, which is likely extinct, and then Aleutian shield fern. So which species were listed primarily due to climate change? Not that many. Few species were listed fully due to climate change, but those that were include polar bear, and then the bearded seals and ringed seals. And I'm sorry if I'm missing any other nymph species that were. However, that doesn't mean that climate change is not impacting other species, but it was specifically the loss of sea ice is the driver for those 3 that I mentioned. So I'm going to talk a little bit really quickly about just how it is impacting just one of our other species, but it's not just this one other species. And it's really just because I love this picture. So the spectacled eider. So spectacled eiders were listed in 1993 because the species declined by as much as 98% in Western Alaska. And so here's their entire breeding range in Western Alaska is the red and the white. They're currently limited to the red areas in Western Alaska and then Russia. So, but it was the loss of decline in Alaska that was the driver for listing in 93. So the initial factors that caused the decline were unknown and still are. A little bit about spectacled eiders. So they spend most of the year on marine waters where they feed primarily on clams. They nest in the red areas on the map, in coastal tundra near shallow ponds, and then they move offshore to molt. They have 4 molting areas that we're aware of, these little green areas. And then after molt, all the birds actually move south of St. Lawrence Island and overwinter in one area. And this is an aerial photo of a group of eiders overwintering in the sea ice. So while they weren't listed due to climate change, there's a lot of their life history depends on sea ice. So as there's a lot of uncertainty, what will happen in the winter as the sea ice continues to change? As I mentioned, all of the both the Russia and the US population all go south of St. Lawrence Island. In addition, they feed on benthic biomass. So as the sea ice changes and the benthic biomass changes, there's just a lot of uncertainty and what is going to happen. So initial information from satellite marked birds indicates that at least some portions of the population will move north in response to sea ice retreat, but it's unclear how that northward migration will affect their survival or reproductive capacity. So what does endangered species management mean in Alaska? I mean, are we actually managing these species? In the lower 48, endangered species management can be very intense. There's been so much development, that we have to manage a lot of species, intensely. Some species, such as red-cockaded woodpeckers, rely heavily on forest management practices, prescribed burning, Other, endemic plant species might require fencing off to keep cattle off of them. But in places such as Alaska that's still wild and has not been developed like the lower 48, many of our species do not need active management or don't really want us to actively manage them. So what do we do? What does management look like? Instead, while we're not actively managing the species, we work with federal agencies to reduce the threats that we can. We work with them to minimize threats and impacts, things such as reducing human-bear conflicts, protecting those polar bear dens, underwater noise management for sea otters, reducing ship collisions for eiders, working to get lead shot off the landscape. So we're often working on some of the smaller threats that we can. We do have some cases where we are actively managing or have and are actively managing species. And I'm going to talk a little bit about wood bison in just a second. So first I'll discuss Steller's eider. So another eider species, a little bit of background. They were listed as threatened in 1997. And again, only the breeding population in Alaska was listed as threatened. And so they breed here in Alaska in 2 locations, up north in Utqiagvik, around in Arctic coastal plain around Utqiagvik, and then on the YK Delta, the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. So they were, as I mentioned, they were listed in 1997 due to that range contraction, which included a disappearance from the YK Delta. So I should know this. I don't know when the last nest was found on the YK Delta. Got it. So after they were listed for that reason, and since then they have not made a comeback on the YK Delta. So we have a joint recovery team for both the spectacled and Steller's eiders, and they met and began investigating the potential for a reintroduction onto the YK Delta. So this was not done alone. The Alaska Sea Life Center was a major player in this, and they did a lot of the work. A captive flock was established at the Alaska Sea Life Center. Potential release sites were evaluated, and funding was secured for 2 years of experimental releases. They tested 2 different husbandry methods to see if either one would work. Neither proved successful enough to sustain a large-scale effort. And then there were some additional factors. So we have not moved forward with this project, and for several reasons. So the factors that caused Steller's eider to disappear from the YK Delta initially still remain unknown. So even if we were successfully able to put them out on the landscape, those factors that cause them to disappear are likely still present, and it could be a sink to the population. That, combined with the 2 years of husbandry efforts that we tried that were not fully successful, and additionally, the expense of those efforts, it's about $1 million a year. So it would take a large influx of cash and a lot of work to get to where we could potentially continue to attempt to release birds out on the YK Delta, and without fully understanding the reason for their decline in the first place. We've halted that effort. So we now focus all of our recovery efforts on the coastal plain up near Utqiagvik. So that was Steller's eider, our first attempt at, well, not our first, the Aleutian goose was actually the first effort, but that was a different issue. So Steller's eider was our second attempt, and then more recently, or I guess the same time actually, a different team was working on wood bison. So we have this other little, I don't want to say little used, it's not used as often, but this other section of the Endangered Species Act, Section 10J, And it's a tool for recovery, and it actually provides us with some flexibility. The 10J, it allows us to place experimental populations on the landscape. And these experimental populations must be geographically separate from populations of the same species or subspecies. So that eider reintroduction, that was not a 10J reintroduction, because there are occasionally still eiders on the landscape. So we did not pursue a 10J rule. So under what makes a 10J rule different is that under that, the take prohibitions that are present under the ESA, as well as Section 7 consultation requirements, are relaxed. So for example, for the black-footed ferret 10J rule, it makes incidental harm to ferrets legal as long as it happens as a result of otherwise lawful activities, such as traditional land management practices. In other words, it allows landowners to continue to manage their lands without concerns about violating the ESA, because that's often a big barrier to any reintroduction, is this concern of a regulatory burden on landowners. So 10J rules actually allow the release of species outside of their current or historical range if the release will further the conservation of those species. So it hasn't been used in that way very often. So recently there were 2 species on Guam that it was just used for, and those species weren't moved due to climate change, but actually due to loss of habitat because of brown tree snakes. But Hawaii is working in that direction for some of their species as well. And I would assume it won't be too long before the Southeast has to start doing that, as well as seawater rise continues to happen. So 10J, we did in 2014, we published a final 10J rule with the help of the state of Alaska. This is my last slide. And I say we, the state of Alaska actually did most of the work for that. So we published that 10J rule, which allowed for the establishment of an experimental non-essential population in Alaska. And in 2015, 130 individual wood bison were released near the village of Shigaluk in the lower Inoko, Yukon. And while the number of bison has fluctuated in that, I think it's, well, last I heard, it was like down to 115, it was up to 150. So those bison have some learning to do. But we have another release planned this year or next, which thanks to BLM, and that will supplement that herd. Currently, only 3 release sites were identified in the 10J rule. So to write the 10J rule and get it passed, we have to do an environmental assessment. And those 3 sites are Yukon Flats, Minto Flats, and Lower Inukon, which is where the current population in the states is. But that does not mean that it's prohibited. It just means under the current rule, we cannot release species outside of that, but that does not prohibit us from revising that. And I will stop there. So
thanks, Erin.
Yep.
Thank you so much. You're really on top of it. All I had to do was just pop in and you knew. So making it easy on everybody. Thank you so much for that. Really incredible work that you're doing there with all your partners. The last presentation for the day, you know, we're covering some really amazing work from all of these presenters, really thought-provoking, but I also know that it can be hard to be online for this long. So we have one more presentation. Thanks for hanging in there. And then we're going to have a 15-minute question and answer for these speakers before moving into the panel discussion, which will be the last thing of the day. So I'm going to introduce the next speaker, which is Bill Templin, the Chief Fishery Scientist for Salmon at Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Go ahead, Bill.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I understand I have 40 minutes for this talk, which is really great. I have plenty of stuff. That said, As was mentioned, my name is Bill Templin. I'm the Chief Fishery Scientist for salmon at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. I live and work in Anchorage in the context of the traditional lands of the Dena'ina. Mine is the last talk in this session on the strategy of acceptance in response to changes in the environment. Using salmon as a model organism is particularly appropriate as they spend significant portions of their life cycle in either marine or freshwater systems and are exposed to the risks and benefits from changes in both systems. While there is a wealth of interesting research into this topic, my task today is to present an overview of the systems used by the state of Alaska to adaptively manage this resource, with an emphasis on the flexibility existing within the system to adapt for changing production. The short version of this talk usually takes 45 minutes, but I only have 15 to 20. So I'll cut some corners and I'll talk fairly fast. Feel free to ask questions if I miss something. Alaska is in the heart of the salmon world. The green on this map shows places where salmon are known to exist and spawn in freshwater systems. And Alaska is in the center of that. At the very same time, salmon are at the heart of Alaskans. They're not just another fish, they're our lifeblood. The importance of the ocean on salmon production is obvious, but how and where it becomes important is still debated. Collaborative research between NOAA Fisheries and ADF&G in the Northern Bering Sea is shedding a light on this question by providing an estimate of juvenile abundance using surface trawls at the stations at the black dots on this map on the left. The survey takes place in September. That means that most juveniles will have already spent approximately 2 to 3 months in the ocean. Using genetic information and ages, the abundance of Chinook salmon juveniles in the survey can be matched with the eventual return of adults to the Yukon River, both the Canadian specifically, as well as all of the Yukon River. That's the plot on the right. The relationship here has been consistent for more than a decade and is currently used as a management tool to forecast returns of Chinook salmon to the Yukon River. This relationship is strong evidence that the most important factors affecting abundance happen before the first winter at sea, or at least for now. Thus, ocean conditions when young salmon first leave the river can be expected to have significant effects on production. This does not discount the importance of other sources of mortality, such as predators, temperature, and food availability. But the dependence of salmon on marine waters as juveniles and at older stages makes them susceptible to other large-scale events, such as the recent recurrent marine heat waves that have happened in the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea this past decade. The harvest of Alaska salmon is the longest time series that we have available, about 120 years, and is generally accepted as an index of productivity of the state of Alaska's salmon stocks. As you can see, harvest has fluctuated over this period between decades of high, low, and even decades of long transitional levels, such as in the 1940s to the 1960s. In response to the alarmingly low productivity of salmon in the 1950s and 60s, in 1974, the state began a concerted effort to provide additional production of salmon by using hatcheries. Hatcheries began making substantial contributions to the harvest in the 1980s. The purpose for these hatcheries is to provide fish to be harvested, not for conservation, preservation, or restoration purposes. Hatchery production of salmon continues to act as one tool that provides flexibility for times when the productivity of local populations is reduced. The balance between sustainability and beneficial use of Alaskans, or use by Alaskans of Alaska's natural resources, is written into the state constitution, providing the principles to guide decisions as well as the structures to enact those decisions. By placing the benefits from natural resources into the realm of the common good of Alaskans, the Constitution encourages a situation where a concerned public can interact with a responsive government. The Constitution itself is a useful tool acting in the background, encouraging a responsive and largely local management of resources. capable of acting in more flexible and nuanced ways to challenges such as climate and environmental change. As the management entity on behalf of the state, ADF&G has the responsibility to protect, maintain, and improve the fish, game, and aquatic plant resources of the state, and to manage their use and development in the best interest of the economy and the well-being of the people of the state, consistent with the sustained yield principle. This delicate balance between seemingly conflicting charges is reflected in the words of the presiding principle. Sustained yield contains both the responsibility to provide for resource uses in the present and the responsibility not to endanger use of the resource in the future. While perfect balance is difficult to achieve in stable, let alone variable times, there's little doubt about the intent. Retaining the future in view requires management to anticipate and react appropriately to changes that affect the resource, whether that is climate or catastrophe. An essential part of the structure in the world of fisheries is the Board of Fisheries. A board of 7 members of the public serves as the main decision-making panel on matters of regulations, policies, allocations, and management plans. This effectively separates the executive branch, in this Department of Fish and Game, from those important issues, and it provides means for the public to provide meaningful input. While at times inefficient and unwieldy, this structure provides the mechanism through which local observations and stakeholder concerns about changing productivity and accessibility are heard, and a wider range of potential actions and responses can be explored. One of the main policies developed by the department and the board in tandem reads like a list of recommended actions at the end of any climate change review paper. Its principles are to protect wild salmon and habitat, to manage for escapement ranges that sustain production and consider uncertainty, develop effective management systems, apply the precautionary approach to human activities, encourage public support and involvement, and manage conservatively, commensurate with the uncertainty in the system. So enough with the civics lesson. Now I'll address the biological realities of salmon and their management. I'll start with a simple model for salmon in general. It all begins with spawning in the fall of what I'll call year 0. In the spring, salmon hatch and emerge from the gravel. Many species will stay in freshwater for all of year 1. In year 2, most will leave freshwater for the ocean, but some of those will return at the end of the first summer. Others stay at sea and return at various ages and sizes. Now, I want to point out that this is not true for all species. This is just an example. So this life cycle can then be spread across years to show how this looks in action. We'll start again with eggs spawned in 2010. And those return in years 2, 3, 4, and 5. I dropped year 1 here to make it easier to see. Now let's add 2011 and see how the return ages overlap. 3-year-old fish from 2010 are returning with 2-year-old fish from 2011. Now see how complex it gets when we add a whole generation of production. Using this cartoon, we can see that fish that spawned in 2015 are an assortment of ages of fish spawned from 2010 to 2013, 2 to 5 years in the past. Likewise, the fish that were spawned in 2015 will return over the years 2017 to 2020, 2 to 5 years in the future. Thus, in this example, any given spawning year encompasses a range of direct effects crossing an entire decade. This structure and the strategy of spreading risk across ages effectively mitigates short-term periods of poor production, along with catastrophic events like floods and volcanoes, making salmon biologically adaptable to highly variable environments. Pacific salmon spawn once and then they die. This means that we can use simple models that work for fruit flies and other insects to also model salmon production. I'll demonstrate this quickly with this plot. I have here on the left is the production. It's the harvest plus the escapement that comes from a given brood year. Along the bottom, we'll have the size of the escapement that formed that brood year. Along the diagonal, you can see a line, that's the replacement line. That's where you get back the same number of fish that contributed to the spawning. Above that line is the area where we have potential yields, fish that can be taken from the population for human uses. Down towards the lower escapements, we see reproduction happening, and it's high. It's higher than the line. So at the left side of this graph, an escaped salmon generally produces more fish, more than one fish. However, as we increase the size of escapements, we get to an area where competition kicks in. Fish are jostling for spawning reds, or they're overlaying spawning reds, or maybe there's not enough oxygen in the water. So using a model, we can model the interaction of reproductive potential and competition using historical data. This model then helps define the area of potential yields in this gray area on the plot. And these potential yields then can help inform us how much we can expect to come back as excess fish from a range of escapements. What we call maximum sustained yield, based on this model, is the biggest difference between the dotted line and that one-to-one line. This is the range where, or the area where we have the highest yield for the smallest amount of fish put in. This also then can be traced to the bottom line, which shows us how many spawners would produce that maximum sustained yield. Off to the right, we have the area of carrying capacity. This is where the responsive competition has pressed reproduction down below the one-to-one line. And you can see that at high levels, you won't get back as many fish as you actually put in. This is the region where we expect a population at equilibrium to be, with no fishing occurring. Unfished populations have years of when excess fish are produced and years when not enough fish are produced. It flops back and forth. We can also see that unfished populations actually become more productive when some fishing occurs. Maintaining escapements within the red bars then around this MSY determination provides the highest expectation of good yields for Alaskans to use. Now, we need to notice that these escapement goals are set to provide yield. That means excess fish. Thus, they are well above escapement levels that would cause concern for conservation of the stock. Not making the lower bound of an escapement goal does not make it a conservation issue. Generally, it is still in the area of good yields. I've added this slide about timescales that need to be accounted for when considering actions in the face of change in order to inform our discussions, potentially after I'm done talking here. As you can see, data sets, biology, regulation, and management operate at different time scales. Data can run in the range of decades, from 150 years for that salmon catch time series that I showed you, to escapement goals that sometimes are produced that are available in terms of a few decades. Salmon life cycles, what I showed you in the cartoon, actually is much more complex than I demonstrated. You can have a longer range of return years, such as for Chinook and Chum, or you can have a shortened one, and such as for Pink and Coho, where they return consistently at 2 and 3 years old. Regulatory cycles, generally through the Board of Fish, every area in the state is reviewed every 3 years. So you end up with a 3-year cycle for review of the fisheries and the stocks in a given area. And then for management of the fishery based on the management plan that's adjusted every 3 years. That's applied in scales from weeks to an entire year. We have some fisheries that occur year round on salmon. But of course, there's flexibility in the management system to allow rapid response to what we see happening. So in-season actions can occur in the space of days. We also need to remember that major changes in the landscape are a mixed bag for salmon. This recent study of the effects of glacial retreat on salmon indicates that harm and benefits will vary among species, among life stages, stages of change in the glacial retreat, as well as locations within the river. Finally, I'd like to announce the recent creation of the Salmon Ocean Ecology Program, or SOAP. This is an ADF&G program that is small, but it's formed of capable people and is already leveraging available state resources and building collaborations to answer some of the biggest outstanding questions about salmon and their marine life. This international survey is currently at sea right now and involves cooperation among 5 nations. You can see its expanse covers almost the entire North Pacific Ocean. In addition, there are studies with chump salmon in the AYK region. There's looking at linkages between changing climate and productivity of Yukon River Chinook salmon, species distribution of Chinook salmon in the Bering Sea, and even including determinants of life history in Yukon River chum salmon.
1 minute.
Great, because here I am. I just want to, as a take-home point, I want to make sure it's clear that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game does not manage change. We're in the business of managing salmon resources and their uses in the presence of change. And thus this fits well in the accept category of the RAD. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bill. I really appreciate the talk. What we're going to do now is go to a question and answer session. And I appreciate all the questions that you all have been putting in the chat window. Some of them you're already starting to answer, and I'm loving the back and forth. That's exactly what the chat window is for those kind of discussions going on. I'm going to do my best to go way back up into the chat to find the folks who've already entered questions. If for some reason you feel like you've already addressed them in the chat, there's no reason for us to rehash the conversation so that we can get through as many people's questions as possible. So just say, oh, we got that already in the chat process. I want to go back up here. Roger K has a question for Jim Lawler. Does the National Park Service Vital Signs Monitoring Program include looking at the evolution of the microbial community in response to thawing permafrost in warming soil? And does it consider the potential increase in atmospheric transport of microbes due to the increase in pollutants, which serve as a transport medium?
Yeah, so I wrote Roger, but I guess I'm new to Zoom, so I just messaged him and not everybody, but I can be really brief and say, no, we don't look at microbes or microbial communities. There is a lot of monitoring going on in networks for permafrost. And the Arctic Network is a really good example of that, where they're looking at things like active layer detachments and retrogressive thaw slumps and mapping those on a network-wide basis. And we also have an aquatic ecologist up there who's doing a lot with chemistry. So looking at old carbon showing up in streams. So he's looking at kind of the carbon degradation. So no to the microbial communities, but I guess I would say we've got a good base for partnering with somebody who could tackle something more complex like the microbial communities and thawing permafrost. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Jim. John, you asked Jim and Diane about rocks and our vital signs having predetermined thresholds or management triggers. Did you get that addressed in the chat? I saw some going back and forth with that from Diane.
Yeah, no, I think I did. That was helpful. Thanks.
Okay, great. Diane, did you want to just give the 30-second elevator speech for the benefit of those who weren't following along in the chat? Oh, can't hear you, Diane.
Yeah, you should, right? So basically, I look at thresholds and things like that for ROC resources of concern as something that's value driven, that should be determined by the refuge and considering the partners and lots of different things, and then the cost as well. And, you know, how much do we want to invest in maintaining an ROC versus something else that we could be maybe managing more easily or whatever. I mean, it's a big discussion on basic things.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see here, I'm going to jump over to this. Aldehyde has a question for Bill. He said that the same question that he asked Doug at NOAA Fisheries. Can you shed any light to what might be happening in the disappearance of the salmon in the Chignik area? Thank you for all the great information in this webinar.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry. I made a mental note, but not a physical note to mention that I would respond to the Chignik question. The answer is I have lots of indications for what might be causing what we're currently seeing. But Chignik is a very complex system consisting of two lakes, and they're effectively on either side of the mountains. I guess you could consider Chignik Lake to be smack in the middle of the mountains, but so they have very different systems. One is shallow and warm, early thaw, highly productive. The other is glacially influenced, is heavily shaded, doesn't get a lot of insulation, but still productive, but in a different direction. It has two runs, an early run that uses the Black Lake system on the northwest side of the mountains, and then the Chignik Lake, or the later run. I know those two aren't exactly the same, but that's the language that commonly gets used. What's happening is one of the lakes is filling in. Juveniles that normally use that would move to Chignik Lake. Then we have more juveniles showing up in Chignik Lake. And so the idea is potentially there's more competition, which is reducing the total productivity of the system. But at the same time, we have these fish leaving the system and then going out into marine waters. And in some cases, they go smack out into the middle of a heat wave in the last 5 years, 10 years. We are not able to measure what's happening out there because we currently don't have a juvenile survey out there like we do in Southeast Alaska and the Northern Bering Sea. We're in the process of trying to develop a survey and find the funding so that we can go out and actually look at the marine effects of marine effects on production of Cook Inlet, Kodiak, and Alaska Peninsula sockeye salmon by looking for them in the coastal waters of the western Gulf of Alaska. Long response, but it's complicated. So.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Bill, for following up with that. This question is for Don from Tom Paragi. I get the concept of using geodiversity for a broad brush approach to connectivity for many species, but I am concerned that the connectivity approach generally has seemed to brush over demonstrated examples for which individual species, which is where rubber meets the road for politics of land use management. For example, Boutin et al. Examined the value of river bottoms as corridors for movement of species along strong political movement of species of strong political concerns, such as wolves and moose, in the oil sands region of Alberta. They found that the river bottoms had no greater use for movement than did the uplands. I'm not dismissing the potential value of corridors, but I think conservationists need to begin addressing what will likely be responses of landowners in potential corridors identified. Google Scholar Report for Habitat Effectiveness and Connectivity.
So I would just say that I agree. And I think I see a lot of situations where we let perfect get in the way of good enough, right? And I also think that we need to acknowledge that strip malls are different than the nuances of different habitat types. And so from that perspective, I'm very much if we build it, they will come kind of connectivity person. I want us to acknowledge land ownership and land use when we're doing this planning, instead of defaulting to this is the ultimate model corridor and ignoring all the social and economic considerations, and then it gets thrown out because those are non-starters. And so I hope that got at what he was trying to say, but I do think we need to be integrating social and economic costs into these conversations and acknowledge that animals do have some flexibility, and that there's differences between corridors that are really long, where animals are going to have to live and die within them, and corridors that are crossing a highway in Alaska.
Thanks so much, Dawn. Yeah, it's always a tough issue when you're talking about connectivity for which species or to connectivity for what. I appreciate the answer. Linda Shaw has a question for Bill. Does the Alaska Department of Fish and Game modeling for sustainable yield include salmon harvest by wildlife? And if so, how?
That's a really good question too. The answer is yes, but not directly. Many of our counts of escapement, our assessments of escapement, happen before the fish actually get to the spawning grounds. They happen at weirs, they can happen at a sonar, in the main stem. So we've got a count of fish going up. Likewise, we have a long time series of returns that come, or the production that comes out of a given escapement size. So in those situations, the number of fish that pass the sonar is related to the productivity, and so it takes into account implicitly the extraction of spawners for bears or eagles. It takes into account, in some cases, even the extraction of fisheries that happen upstream, but only if they're smaller. If they're large enough to have an effect on that number, then we go look at them. But yes, we do, because we're managing on the system as a whole. But no, we don't, as in we don't go count bears on the river and then try to make sure that we've got 6 fish per day for each bear. That's much too fine level. So probably unsatisfying. I apologize, but that's the way it's working. We have to work with it in general, the system as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. And Linda, just to let you know, I'm looking at both the question and answer and the chat, kind of trying to get them in order that folks put them in. Linda has a follow-up, and so does Bill. So Bill, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I could probably give you a much better and more detailed result if you want to contact me. I'm open for anybody to contact me. My contact I didn't have up on my slide. I should have, but you can reach me through the Department of Fish and Game.
Great. And Bill, you can throw your email into the chat window if you feel like that.
Will do.
Linda has a follow-up. Does Fish and Game modeling take into account forest fertilization and health from salmon carcasses dispersed by wildlife?
No. It's an interesting idea that's been tossed around for a long period of time. However, the number of fish, the escapement gulls, when they exist, stay fairly stable. They move around a little bit, but they're not jumping around year to year or even potentially decade to decade. So the amount of fish being provided upstream after they spawn, they die, and they're available to be, or even before they spawn, they're available to be dragged up into the weeds by a bear or dropped by an eagle, or many of the other ways of spreading them out on the landscape. So we're not managing for nutrient input into the terrestrial ecosystem, but it's a benefit of allowing for managing for high amounts of passage, which we're doing for yield, not down at the level where we're trying to manage for sustained conservation issues or restoration. Again, I invite you to reach out to me.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Nathan Ellswick says the Bering Sea trawl fleet reported dumping over 10,000 individual dead halibut per day last week. Just the last 2 weeks, they've reported dumping over 100,000 dead halibut. And I saw another comment in there about dumping king salmon as well. Just not sure if that's a question, more just to bring that up to concern, but if anyone would like to respond to that, you're welcome to.
I'll take a quick stab at that. Sorry, this shouldn't be the Bill Templin show here, but the king salmon have to be retained. And there are observers on most of these boats where they're actually sampled on board. Halibut, that's not my specialty, but I can ask around for you and find out what the regulations are on that, and get you some information.
Thanks, Bill. Seal Smith says, for Don Magnus, are agencies considering assisted migration to help small ranging or slow moving species overcome natural or anthropogenic barriers?
So I would answer yes, we're starting to consider it, but just acknowledge that it's going to be slow because we're building a framework that's almost a new worldview, right? Because we have a lot of the way we do business tied into historical condition and assumptions that the world is stationary, right? And so when we start thinking about moving away from that, a lot of our stories are about messing up, adding something somewhere and having it be a problem. And so we're starting to have those deep conversations to set up the framework where we can understand agency values in relationship to this new problem. So it's probably going to be a slower go.
Absolutely. I think that's in part, that's what this workshop is about, is to start to frame that new worldview and some of the differences between what we've been doing historically and what we need to do moving forward. Thank you for that. Aldehyde has another question for Bill. It is the Bill Templin show. You mentioned you don't manage change, but manage fisheries in the midst of change. Regarding the regulatory process and run timing, will ADF&G be looking at any regulatory change system other than emergency orders to adapt to changing run timing?
Emergency order management, again, a good question, has to do with the regulatory system. Management plans are developed through the board process with input from the department as well as the public. So that happens through the board process. In it, it provides some flexibility for managers to make certain decisions as long as certain parameters are met. And then on top of that, for daily management, we have the EO, or the emergency order, which comes from the managers, but the managers are acting in the, they're effectively acting as the commissioner of the department. So they're acting under that person's authority, his or her authority. So this management system allows users to understand what the playing field is, because there's a management plan. And then when that plan needs to be changed on the fly, it's only changed in specific ways, and again, under the authority of the commissioner, not at the whim of the local manager. So again, I hope that helps.
One more for you. Oh, go ahead.
I would be very careful with changing the system. It is painful. Anybody who sat through a board meeting, either of game or of fish, it is painful, but it's better than all the options. So.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, we got two more questions, and they're both about salmon. Well, not two more questions. Next two questions that are lining up are both about salmon. So question for Bill from John Morton. Given that salmon management needs to consider 120 years out, how is that accommodated in regulatory processes that are only 2 to 7 years? So that's a good follow-up to what you were just saying. Along those same lines, does flooding the marine system with hatchery-raised salmon threaten long-term viability, particularly as food resources are changing so quickly in response to ocean currents, heat, blogs, and acidification?
Heat blobs. Sorry.
Blogs, yes, gotta love those heat blogs. All right, well, I will handle those in order. The first question is has to do with managing for the future. And I think you could see from the plots that were shown earlier about what the expected temperature rise is based on separate models, is how the traces change. And the further you get from today, current measurements, the more diverse they can get. So managing for the future for 120 years out is, I would say, going to inherently lead to potentially bad decisions than managing it for the near future, something in terms of lifespan of a salmon or a couple of generations, but managing with the principle in mind that you not only have to sustain that population, but you need to sustain it at a level where it's useful. It provides uses for Alaskans. So that principle will help guide that slow, more steady change than trying to project long-term and then taking the most conservative action. Because conservation usually comes at the expense of the use of the resource. Second question, I'm gonna take a little bit different position than you, John. Flooding the oceans with hatchery salmon it's a common theme, a common trope. It's showing up in a lot of publications. Usually those publications all of those publications are using a recent publication by Ruggiero and Irvine, where they did the massive task of trying to pull together information from 5 different countries and come up with an estimate of the abundance and biomass of pinks, sockeye, and chum in the ocean. So everybody's using that data set. Unfortunately, that data set has no sense of uncertainty on it. I'm not fighting against it. It's a great piece of work. However, in order to measure effects, we have to take in things such as measurement error in our models. It's very important to understand at least the structure of your measurement error. So we could have a great long talk on this. I probably could have given the talk. However, because I'm from a management agency, we have to be a little more circumspect or we have to be more sure when we're looking at something that we can follow the line of cause, because if we pull the wrong lever, right, if we assume a cause rather than having it relatively established, or at least reasonably possible, then we have the potential again of making a wrong decision. If you want to look at pink salmon, which is commonly used as an example, hatchery pinks make up about 15% of the total biomass of pink salmon in the ocean. And that includes Russia and the United States. Most of the United States ones are coming from Alaska. Let's split it evenly. So 7.5% of the biomass out there, and I'm just pulling these numbers just from my memory, so don't quote me on this. This is on the video, I understand, so I could be wrong, I should go check. But it's 15%, I'm pretty sure of that. And then if we take half of that, 7.5% of the biomass of salmon, of pink salmon in the ocean is from Alaska hatcheries. So that said, I'm not arguing against competition amongst salmon species in the ocean. I just think that before we start driving for change in human systems that human users rely on, that we nail down what the causal pathway is prior to attempting to make the change, because it affects people on the ground and communities. So
absolutely, yeah. Thank you for that, Bill. I know that was a tough one. We're going to move now to the panel discussion, and I apologize for those of you who did not get your questions answered. And I do encourage folks to continue answering questions in the chat window. For example, Nicole Schmitt asked a question to Erin about Eskimo curlew, and Nicole also asked a question for Matt. Are there any species you've documented on the Kenai that are notable indicators of climate change or ecological change? And then in the question and answer section, Ed Schmitt, to follow up on the salmon topic, Bill, while I appreciate the escapement model for salmon management, that has not been consistent with what I have seen on the Kenai king population for over the last 35 years, what possible flaws in the model may be responsible for the discrepancy? To the organizers, are you going to save the chat for this session? I'm going to leave that up to Nicole, but I believe the answer is yes. If we'll do everything we can to save the chat. We're also going to have a report that will come from this. It's going to be a pretty high level report. It's not going to be a transcript because nobody wants to read 3 days of meeting transcripts. But hopefully some of these big ticket items will be also in the report. So please do keep answering the questions in the chat while we move to the panel discussion. So for the panelists are all of the folks who gave presentations today. And so I will ask that you turn on your cameras if you have the equipment and your bandwidth allows. Of course, we understand if you have slow internet and you have to keep your camera off, or maybe you are still in your pajamas and you don't want us to know about it. But we will be moving to this, the facilitated panel discussion. And the discussion, we can go in a lot of different directions. But the question, the prompt that we want to provide to get people started, to get the panelists started, is do we need more or different monitoring? So for folks to go ahead and who want to ask questions to the panelists, you can continue to put them into the chat. You can put them into the Q&A. And for the panelists, there's no rhyme or reason for one person talking over another. Just jump right in, or you can raise your hand at the bottom of your screen. There should be a thing to raise your hand like this. Or anyway, where it's going to be pretty casual, and we're going to go to the top of the hour. Diane, why don't you take us off?
Sure, I'll just take a stab at this. I don't think it's a question of more or different. I mean, the question we should be asked, are we doing the right monitoring in the right places? I mean, the question has to come first. It's not just a question of, what should we monitor? I mean, we could monitor all kinds of things, and we can do inventories on all kinds of things, but we need to define the questions first, right? Before we say we need more monitoring. We could always use more data, I suppose, but I think we can be smarter about it.
John?
Yeah, I want to jump in there too. 2 points I want to make, and one has to do with Matt Bowser's work, and the other one has to do with sort of the RAD framework in general. It's a little bit premature now because we're kind of on day one, and all we're really talking about are almost standard practice. They're practices that we do now, right? And so I'm hoping there'll be some clarity that comes out by the end of day 3 when we start talking about resisting and we start talking about accepting that one of the outcomes of that is we need to start asking this question of how long do we monitor? How long do we accept? And that's the beauty of RAD, is that it really forces that question. At what point do we go, okay, we need to resist, or at what point do we need to direct? Or alternatively, we may be resisting now in some instances, and there might be a time to abandon it and go back to accepting. So, and that's kind of why I asked that question of both Jim and Diane about, do we have thresholds or triggers put into any of this monitoring? That was sort of the thought process behind why I was asking, and I know they know that, but that's fine. The other comment I had to do with Matt's work, and of course I'm very familiar with everything that Matt's done, and the significance of being able to do biodiversity inventorying and monitoring now cheaply just should be a game changer for us. I mean, we shouldn't be looking at this like, oh, it's a nice to do. It's more like we really should be doing this, because as assemblages are changing, the species that are least likely to go or most likely to go extinct are the ones that we're not monitoring right now. It's all these invertebrates. And we need to be on that. We need to, when we talk about things like corridors and connectivity, that's great for species that move quickly. But for species that move slowly, the corridors really won't make any difference in the real scheme of life. It's not going to happen fast enough. So that's the way I think about this kind of stuff. So I'm just throwing it out there.
Sorry, you're supposed to read my mind, Dawn. And of course, I said I called on you. So go ahead, Dawn.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I was just thinking about, like, I appreciated Diane's answer that some thresholds and triggers for management are value-based, but I also want to acknowledge that some are ecological and some are indicators of thresholds where we're going to see a transformation in the ecosystem. And I think with our, we have to pull in a lot of data sources because it's like fuzzy and looking into the future. But in the past, we've looked at models a lot in terms of like what predicting the future or assigning probabilities to different outcomes. But there's also a component of learning and finding these indicators that one trajectory or another is unfolding. And so that's something I've been thinking a lot about is, what things will we see? Like for instance, in the Kenai, if we start seeing fires in the grass every 10 to 15 years, that's a reinforcing feedback on a grassland system, which would give us indications of the realities of management on the ground. And so that's just another way to think about monitoring when we're trying to figure out what's unfolding as we're managing in real time.
Great, thanks, Dawn. Okay, I'm going to pass it over to Jim, and then I'm going to go to a question in the chat, and then we'll come back to the panelists.
Yeah, so I guess this is my opportunity to make a pitch for simplicity in monitoring, monitoring basic information that can feed into, provide basically the grist for more complex modeling or more complex investigations, but also, make a pitch for a more coordinated effort at monitoring, because, there's not an unlimited amount of resources in terms of people or money, things like that. And, a lot of what we know ecologically is based on specific sites or specific locations. So, some of the stuff that Don was talking about in terms of landscape level corridors and just landscape level things, it just seems to me we would advance ourselves substantially if we put more emphasis on monitoring at a geographical scale and getting answers at a larger geographical scale than kind of these focused areas. So I'll make a pitch for that. Greater cooperation and then sharing of, everybody comes along and they want to be the one who invented this great tool to monitor species X or species Y. And, we really need to be cautious about that. If somebody has a protocol or something they're monitoring that you can pick up and apply to your area, that's going to give a larger inference to a larger area, that should be a big consideration in terms of how you move forward with your monitoring or your inventory.
Yeah, excellent points, Jim. Jeremy and Bill, did you want to jump in before I'm about ready to change the subject. So if you guys wanted to jump in, I'm more than happy to give you the floor.
No, that's all right. We can move on.
Okay, well, hold the thought. If you want to come back to it, I'm more than happy to. Linda Shaw says one issue that hasn't been mentioned is invasive species and climate change. Invasive species are those outside of their native range that are also considered harmful to ecosystems and human economies or health. I would exclude range expansions of otherwise native species from this category of species. John says, I have a presentation on day 3 that gets to that. Did you want to talk about that, John, or do you want to just table that for next week?
I'd like to punt on it for now, but I can tell you in advance, it's a good one to tune in on it from the standpoint that it's pretty blasphemous, and a lot of people won't like what I have to say, but what the heck. Live and die, live and learn, whatever.
Bill.
I appreciate John saying that, because I actually this morning extracted some language where I referred to salmon as one of the most successful invasive species in Alaska's history. So
that's a good point. Yeah.
I mean, that said, one of the reasons I was looking forward to being part of this conversation and this whole workshop is exploring these types of ideas where, how do you decide on what are your metrics for deciding, or your principles for deciding whether something is an invasive species, an opportunistic species, or just a range expansion. So thanks.
Actually, to follow up on Bill's comment, and I hope, Matt, you'll jump in on this, is because Matt has done a huge amount of work on nativity, okay? And one of the things as he gets into the invertebrate world is he's finding all of these species new to Alaska, but we know nothing about the significance of them because nobody else has similar data. So we don't know if they're unique to Alaska, they're unique to the Kenai, they're unique to North America. We know nothing about them because nobody else has complementary data. And this whole issue of nativity is a big one because species are already moving. That was, Tom and Doug's presentations was all about how all these species are already moving. And nativity is kind of off the table. And to kind of give you a sense of where I'm going to head, and day 3 with this conversation about invasives is I think we need to drop a lot of these adjectives. They're just species, and be done with calling them, native or non-native, invasive or non-invasive. I'm kind of done with it. And anyway, Matt, I hope you'll jump in there and say something about invertebrate, nativity, if nothing else.
Sure. Yeah. Well, just the experience that your perspective can change overnight. So just with an example of a snail that we picked up here, it's not a rare snail, but we thought it was exotic, and I talked with experts. The best experts in North America believed it to be exotic in North America and Alaska, and there's good evidence, a good reason to believe that, because we have documentation of it being introduced into New York State and then being making its way across North America all the way to the west over the last century, and so we thought the population we had here was also exotic, but it just so happened I had sequenced ours and looking at species IDs, so I really scrutinized it further, and it was identified as a big-eared radix. But when we looked more closely, it was actually more closely related to old world sequences from Kamchatka and the Kurils. So what we had was a Beringian relics, which is actually, it was a unique population. So now it's gone from being what we thought was exotic to something that, wait a minute, this is not only is it native, it's endemic. It's an endemic population that is something special. So that's just one example of how things change, especially as you start looking more broadly.
That's impressive. John, on a humorous note, I was going to add a comment I added around 7:30 this morning to you. I love the fact that you continue to make the rest of us look really good. Thank you so much for that. Love you, John.
Linda Shaw says, just to put in a plug for general monitoring, when we did some sampling on St. Paul, we found all kinds of invertebrates not before documented there. So that general monitoring has some value. Bill.
Yeah, just following along on the thread of this conversation. I used to run the genetics program here at the department. And part of our job was building baselines. And I can tell you there were so many times and places where people said there aren't salmon in that stream, or they're not in that area, or not that species. And in the course of our studies, we'd go out and sure enough, we'd find them. And eventually we began to ask folks the question, are they not there because they're not there? Or are they not there because you haven't looked? And that was a really important point. And I think the idea of general monitoring in some situations is probably would save a lot of time and effort. So
yeah, and Bill, just to follow on that, I think that while species are changing and resorting, migrating because of climate change in order to track their climate niches, general monitoring would pick up on new species coming into that area. And so if you're working on a particular land unit, if you're working on a refuge or a state park, and you say, oh, well, our population's declining. Well, maybe it's not declining, maybe it's just moving northward. So I don't know if that's general monitoring or if it's coordinated monitoring across agencies that I'm talking about, but I will go to Doug next.
I was going to offer this thought, and this is kind of bubbled to the surface here from other discussions down in the Kenai and out in Bristol Bay. I think we all acknowledge the scale and scope of Alaska. It's huge, it's immense, and there's that financial ability to actually implement useful monitoring programs, whether it be up in the watersheds in the interior or the coastal areas. It's immense. It's a big ask, and there's a lot of money needed to do that. But I can't help but think we need to shift our focus and stop just applying a Western philosophy to that. I think in all these coastal communities and all the villages up all these watersheds, there is no reason. There are people chomping at the bit to get involved. And I can't help but think we could train up some people and have them do water sampling for us, or or just data points of every village in the Yukon. Every day, a kid goes out and takes the temperature, goes out in his dinghy and takes a temperature. I think we have a lot of resources that we're not attempting to utilize. And I can't help but think that there's so much more we could be doing if we step out of the strictly science box and start to employ the population of the state. It would cut down on costs, and they want to get involved, utilize our resources.
Thanks, Doug. That's a great, and I see someone in the comments, Chandra Post says right on. A question to the panel from Nikki Schmitt is, what kinds of considerations do all of you think about when deciding accept until when? The question of accept until when. Are there best practices for how much or what kind of data are needed before making that decision? For example, numbers of years that something has been monitored. Okay, I see Don first and then Jim second, or maybe you guys did it at the same time, but that's the order you are in my Brady Bunch squares. So Don.
I win. Yeah, just a short thought. I think it's really important for us to have a way to think about amplifying and reinforcing feedbacks in our ecosystems, and to think about when to accept or transform or direct in terms of being aligned with the emerging conditions. So some sorts of ways to have checks that, especially with climate, that the things we're doing are aligning with those new realities.
Thanks, Don. Jim?
Yeah, I guess, so this is from, a lot of this is from looking at wildlife populations in terms of population trends and cycles and things like that. And I think about, caribou, which, might cycle every 80 years in terms of trajectories, tundra, adapted caribou species, and the forage that goes with it, like lichens and things like that. And it makes me think about how a lot of these conservation units were set up. And we heard about ANILCA from a couple people today. And, so when I hear Bill talk about 120 years of data for salmon, I'm like, wow, that's the kind of data set we need for a lot of these species. And one of the reasons I think about this is one of the guidance for the Park Service in terms of managing species is we manage for natural and healthy populations. And so in order to define what a natural and healthy population is, you need to have some time frame, some historical time frame of how much that population varies over that time frame. And so, you know, these ideas of thresholds, gosh, you know, a lot of the data sets we have just, you know, we can start to think about thresholds, but we really aren't going to have that information until we get these longer data sets, which again puts an emphasis on long-term data sets and working to, keep monitoring, you know, specific things that they're finding useful. Of course, throughout things that if they aren't proving useful in terms of monitoring or not relevant to you know, managers or people living in the area or whatever, toss those out. But you know, really puts an emphasis on we need long-term data for a lot of these systems.
Great, thanks. So I want to, before I come to you, John, I want to go to Jeremy, and Jeremy put some comments in the chat. And Jeremy, I would like it if you could talk a little bit about that. You can read it because I haven't read it, and or just say what you said again.
I just put them in there because they were motivated by our earlier monitoring conversation, but to the extent that's still ongoing, you know, we posed a little bit of a straw construct in how we would choose our monitoring efforts if we could do them differently. And there's a couple things that really make it tough. One of those is that, you know, we don't often know for sure, or maybe even can't always anticipate where our models and efforts are going to fail given historical experience. If we did know that, we'd be much smarter about monitoring. And that's part of the reason we have the dilemma that we do. On the other hand, I think Diane pointed out that, you know, we often are anticipating where the critical thresholds or hinge points are in some of these systems. We know a fair amount in some cases and know what to look for. And so that makes our monitoring smarter than it otherwise would be. But I think there's a couple things here. And somebody, I can't remember who, touched on it just a little bit ago. And that's that, you know, we're used to thinking that we need a sufficient baseline, and legally in many cases we do in order to act differently, right? We have to defend those based on that science and that long-term baseline. But in some of these new, you know, in this brave new world, we're going to get to the point where we miss the opportunity to act, to choose direct, for example, as opposed to accept or to fail in our resistance. You know, there are direct consequences to insisting on monitoring to guide those actions. And some monitoring is going to help us, but in some cases, we're going to have to choose in ways that are uncomfortable and maybe even quite difficult given the current legal structure. So we have to think ahead about where that's going to put us. We're going to have to learn to be wrong sometimes. We're going to have to learn to be surprised in ways that are even maybe more awful than the ones that we're historically used to. But I'm curious about other people's thoughts on that, because for me, it's something of a dilemma. You know, it's really hard for management agencies to make those choices without that grounding. So, you know, what do we do in those instances? What latitude do we have?
Absolutely. And while I'm passing it back to John, because you had your hands up, I want to mention that Don put in the chat, does the concept of naturalness work anymore if they are tied to historical conditions? So that's a natural follow-up on what Jeremy said. So not only is it, do we know where the models fail, but also, you know, given that the reality of what the models are even talking about is no longer the reality, does that still work for the concept of naturalness? John, you're next.
I think
John, you're muted.
Thanks.
So,
there you go.
so this was a night. I'm basically following up on Jeremy's, even though it's sort of an independent thought, but Jeremy really framed the problem well. One of my big concerns is, you know, we definitely need long-term data sets. The question is which data sets, right? And that's kind of a problem, and particularly for agencies with limited capacity. One of my big concerns, and you know, and this applies to Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service and any other entity out there, is that you know, we could invest a lot of energy monitoring the wrong thing, right? And that's one concern. And so we need to kind of, you know, bet hedge a little bit on how we think about that. And so there's two things I'm really an advocate for in the I&M world. One is I think we need to do a lot more inventories. I don't think we have enough data for Alaska in general. We need to do a lot of inventories, and everybody wants to jump to monitoring very quickly. And I'm saying, no, let's do inventories. The other thing is that depending on the resource, I would argue that, you know, some can be just one-time inventories, like say some of the work that Matt Bowser is doing, where he's documenting, you know, these massive species assemblages across the landscape. But other ones could be, the purpose of it could be to establish a baseline, right? So a baseline from a statistical perspective. So you actually do just enough monitoring that you can establish, you know, depending on the species you're working with or the resources, you know, the interseasonal and interannual variation, capture it and then stop. Go do something else, right? Because we don't have enough time to sit there and monitor everything. So just grab your baseline, establish a nice confidence interval around it, and move on and do something else. And then beyond that, I mean, one of the things that I also mentioned earlier about RAD, and it'll come out over the next 2 days, I hope, is this, again, I mentioned it earlier, but you'll hear it tomorrow morning, this larger issue of rather than relying on real-time passive monitoring in real time, is that we go to an experimental mode to kind of accelerate this so that we can kind of get ahead of what's actually happening. So if you do want to influence the outcome, you have a little bit of lead time rather than just being there in real time. And then I think you'll also hear how significant monitoring will become in an adaptive management paradigm, particularly in a directed context. And you'll hear that when I think Dawn will talk about it, and I think Abby Lynch will talk about it, and you realize that we probably need adaptive management capacity within agencies in the very near future. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, John. You bring up an important point, because there's a couple different purposes for monitoring. One is to detect change, how things are changing over time. Another is to detect the impact of a management action or a management activity. And the way that you would set up those monitoring efforts would be quite a bit different. So it's important to be clear about that from the start. Adelheid says, Doug, doesn't some of what you're talking about regarding monitoring done by groups like the Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council already?
Let me find my.
Oh, and then
yeah,
just saw that you responded.
Well, I attempted to respond, and so yes, I don't know exactly the level of monitoring and data collection they're doing. I know that's taking place, but I mean, so that's a good start. How far up the watershed? As I responded, how far up the watershed? What sub-watersheds? Are they watersheds, or are they sources of water where, for example, king salmon are spawning in an area where that's under the direct influence of permafrost? And how is melting permafrost influencing that? Ice scour and hyporheic zones, traditional spawning. There's so much there that could be asked, but not to expand too quickly, but I think what John and everybody's touching on here is, okay, identify the question. You need to go through a triage and identify what you're actually trying to answer the question for. It's got to be very targeted. And so I think it's very possible. And I think, yeah, but you need to go through that planning process. What answers do we seek? What are the questions we're asking? And what specific data is going to identify that? So yeah, to the question, yeah, similar to what the Yukon's doing. I know there's been a lot of work by NOAA and ADF&G collaborating in the YK deltas, or in the Yukon Delta anyways. And those are all tremendous efforts. I don't see a lot of published information coming out about what's happening upstream.
Yeah, definitely, Doug, that's a good point. The Northern Latitudes Partnership, which is what's left over from the Landscape Conservation whatever collaboratives. I should know that acronym. but they're working on a lot of that with community monitoring to look at, you know, across gradients and across territorial boundaries as well. Abigail mentioned that we're going to touch on some of these monitoring approaches and these themes that we're talking about now in tomorrow's talk and the talk for tomorrow morning. I'm going to, Jim, I have I'm going to change the subject here, but Jim, I saw that your hand was raised. Would you like to say something before I move on?
Yeah, this was just more of an observation than anything. So I'm going to age myself a little here. So when I started with the I&M program with the Park Service, George Bush was in office. And so climate change was a dirty word at the time. And so the monitoring program was designed to look at, you know, perturbations to the system. And, you know, we can't escape climate change these days, but, you know, by and large, you know, that we're talking a little over 20 years ago. So climate change has become much more forefront in everybody's thinking, but a lot of the monitoring programs that are in existence, I shouldn't say a lot, at least somewhat, are there to look at climate change, but also industrialization. Somebody, you know, I've heard ocean acidification mentioned a few times. There's another perturbation. And, you know, climate change is kind of the umbrella over all these things. But I guess my point is, at least some of the monitoring that's going on, the data can be useful for climate change, but, you know, it's not, people are talking about targeted things specifically for climate change, which I totally get, and that's going to be informative for climate change. But I'm just thinking of the realities of agency work. You know, they're also interested in industrial development. They're interested in, you know, we've talked about invasive species. So, you know, all these things are kind of layered. So in some form, agencies, if they monitor, they're going to have to monitor things that kind of address multiple masters. Anyway. Just kind of an observation.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I'm just so impressed with the collective experience around this topic here on the panel. I guess that's the point of the panel discussion, but I really appreciate all of your insight and really vast experience, not only with the topic, but in the region. I'm going to pass it now to Meda, and she would like to talk a little bit about the internal acceptance part of all of this. So it's taking us a little bit out of our brains and more into our hearts or our emotions around all of these topics, which can be it's a very real phenomenon. And yeah, I'm sorry, I have 15-month-old twins and they just came into the room.
Oh my gosh, sending is giving you props, twins. Ganesh, Amanda. Yeah, so as we move through this, for some of us, we've known about climate change and even maybe the severity of climate change for some of us decades, as James has talked about. But for other people, it's new to this because it's been largely not in the main commentary in the United States. And because of our ability to buffer ourselves from certain content, there's still people who are coming into awareness about climate change. And so there's a real human component in this process. We need to remember as we're giving this information that we're talking about not only the species of invertebrates and plants and animals and fish and birds, but also the human species needs to adapt and to shift and change. And this is going to take a process of really looking internally into our internal emotions and being able to move through the process. They're calling it solesthesia or climate grief, and it's real experiences. You know, in California, we watched as people's homes burned, and in Australia, and we've watched here in the state flooding that's happened, and all over the United States. And these events are going to become more and more, you know, sorry, I have a lot of stuff going past here, but they're going to happen more regularly in our experience. And so we have to recognize that the human emotions associated with this are going to become traumatic because the trauma is an unmitigated stressor that people don't have the coping skills to deal with. So we'll talk more about that on Friday, but you know, we just take a moment and breathe. Let's center in our bodies, you know, ground in on your feet and do a nice horse stance and breathe deeply into your abdomen and recognize that we ourselves may be triggered, or the people that we're giving information to may be triggered, and to recognize that there's going to be a lot of emotions coming up through this process. And as they do, it's okay to observe them and acknowledge them, because humans are emotional beings, right? We usually process on that level differently than we do on the intellectual level. And so take that time, and if you need to go for a walk, that's one way that you can do it. Some people journal as they go through this. And for us who've been dealing with it for decades, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But for people who are new to this information, it's literally the end of the world. So taking that time to make sure that we hold space and let them go through that process of acceptance and grief. And then we can go into the talking about how do we radically adapt and change our culture and the environment that we're in. So just maybe sit with that over the evening, and I'll hand it back over to Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meda. Diane Francis put into the chat, be sure to look into Glenn Albrecht's book on Earth Emotions. He offers a vocabulary, including solastalgia, which to help us to speak about these feelings. Freddie Allen says, thanks, Meda. In times of historically low salmon abundance, many people and communities along the Yukon and Kuskokwim are experiencing extreme hardships. And I'll add personally that you said that those of us that are used to this, this is our field, it might not seem like we're affected by it on the surface, but you know, it's like the death by 1,000 cuts. It might not be something that we're aware of, but from an emotional body standpoint, it probably is impacting us. John, I saw that you were kind of leaning in. We only have 2 minutes left, so we're going to start wrapping it up. I think it's appropriate to leave you with the last word, so I want to turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, because I want to kind of put just say something about Friday's talk. You know, Dawn and I worked together for a very long time, and we've experienced the climate grief, and where it's coming from is one day you realize for real that the entire world is being manipulated by humans. And once you realize that, you go into shock. And you know, it's a grieving period. And after you go through your 5 stages of grief, there's an outcome there. You either decide that humans are part of nature or nature is dead. And that's a pretty horrible place to end up. And I think in our instance, we have begun to realize that humans really are part of what we call nature. And the talk that Roger is going to talk about and Meda will talk about on Friday kind of touches on that whole issue. And so I hope people will stick through this.
Thank you, John, and perfect timing to wrap up ahead of the top of the hour. I would like to extend thanks to all of the panelists and presenters today for the fascinating talks, and also really going there, not holding back with the panel discussion and bringing up some controversial or thought-provoking or even emotion-provoking topics. So really appreciate that. And then Nicole, would you like to say any last words?
I think that about summed it up. Thank you so much to everyone who attended today, and we will see you tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Alaska time. So thank you again. And the presenters, I know everyone viewing can't give a round of applause or say thank you, so you can drop those thanks to the panelists in the chat and we'll make sure that they see them. But thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Bye, everybody.
I'm just going to stay on a little bit to let these thank yous pour in, but otherwise I'll sign off in just a couple minutes.
Is there any need to debrief, or are we good for tomorrow?
I'll give you a call.
Okay.
Or you can stay on.
Well, yeah, just call me later. Call me when after you have a chance to do whatever.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, bye.